Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, my name is Frank Baker, District 3 City Councilor. I'm the chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Planning and Development and Transportation. I'm joined by my colleagues, the, lead sponsor of part of this here, Councilor Kenzie Bach, and then in order of arrival are Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Ruzzi Louijen, and Councilor Tanya Fernandez Anderson. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will be rebroadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Verizon Channel 964. We will take public testimony at the end of this hearing. If you wish to testify via video conference, you can please email Cora, CORA.Montran, MONTROND, at boston.gov for the link. When you are called, please state your name and affiliation or residence, and limit your comments to no more than 2 minutes. And you also may submit written testimony. Today's hearing is on docket 0192, in order for a hearing regarding using planning and land use tools. And we kind of merged it together with another docket 0314, in order beginning the process of sunsetting urban renewal in the city of Boston until, well, this says December 31st, 2022. That may change, but we'll talk about that here today. Without further ado, we'll turn it over to our first panel, which is made up of BPDA people. So if you guys want to start, whatever way you're going to do, we go left to right. Please introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and we can get started. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Councilor Baker. For hosting this hearing. For the record, I'm Devin Quirk, Director of Real Estate. I'll just quickly introduce my three colleagues.
Excuse me, one second. I just need a little bit of house cleaning. Councilor Louijen is co-sponsor on 0192. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Councilor Louijen, for co-sponsoring the hearing. I will introduce myself again. I'm Devin Quirk, Director of Real Estate for the BPDA. Introduce my colleagues quickly. Heather Camposano, our Chief of Staff, Eileen Brophy, our General Counsel, and Chris Breen, our Urban Renewal Manager, who you'll hear from shortly. And we're very eager to be before you today to talk about the future of urban renewal in Boston. We believe it's really important to begin any discussion of urban renewal by acknowledging that the irresponsible use of this tool has done harm and damage to communities, both here in Boston and across the country. The destruction of entire neighborhood, the West End, is a permanent stain on the legacy of urban renewal in Boston and of our decision making. The displacement of thousands of families from their homes is a tragic mistake, and while it would never happen again, it can never be undone. In addition, urban renewal has a history of being closely associated with systemically racist and socially unjust practices of the past. In many cases, it was closely geographically tied to racist redlining and exclusionary housing practices. It is similar in practice to the unjust highway takings of the 60s and 70s, and it has, in too many cases, yielded vacant property which has sat fallow for too long. As the urban renewal agency for the city, the staff of the BPDA are very aware of this legacy of harms and are deeply committed to bringing a social equity lens to our work as an agency going forward. And that said, the history of urban renewal is complex and also has resulted in benefits for the people of Boston. New schools and libraries, exceptional open spaces, new jobs, and affordable homes have all come directly from urban renewal. And as someone who has a background in Boston's affordable housing industry, I think one thing that we do not often acknowledge enough is our city's national leadership in championing mixed income communities. 1 in 5 housing units in our city is an income-restricted affordable housing unit. And while that might not be enough to meet the current needs of our housing crisis, it is better than almost any other community in the country. With 20% of our housing stock is affordable, we're better than New York, Seattle, San Francisco, or any other high-cost city. In our analysis of urban renewal, we've identified nearly 10,000 units of affordable housing built on urban renewal properties. So clearly, urban renewal has had an important role in advancing housing choice and affordability for the people of Boston. The more recent uses of urban renewal tools have largely been limited to much more aligned with progressive, pro-social, and pro-community values. For example, we've been able to use urban renewal tools to prevent the closing of a nursing home in the North End, to acquire property for affordable housing uses in Dorchester, and to permit the redevelopment and recapitalization of over 1,000 deeply affordable BHA housing units in Charlestown. So today, we are before you with a simple request, but one that is deeply tied to a complex history. The agency has been working for the past 6 years on sunsetting urban renewal. There are currently 14 urban renewal districts across Boston that are expiring on April 22nd of this year. So if the council takes no action, all 14 urban renewal districts will expire next month. My colleague Chris will go over this in detail in a moment, but in 2020, we submitted a comprehensive action plan to DHCD. This plan called for the sunsetting of 4 urban renewal plan areas next month. The remaining 10 were set to expire on a staggered basis, with the majority expiring by 2026 and the remaining expiring by 2030. So while the agency has long been promoting the sunsetting of urban renewal, the Wu administration would like us to examine the timeline for this plan in light of today's Boston and our collective vision for the future. We are here to recommend that we allow 5 urban renewal districts areas to expire next month. This includes the 4 urban renewal areas that we originally targeted for a 2022 termination several years ago, plus the addition of the Brunswick King urban renewal area in Dorchester, which we believe will not benefit from urban renewal going forward. We recommend that the remaining 9 urban renewal districts be extended for the remainder of the calendar year until December 31st, 2022. This will allow us time to work with this council, the mayor, our soon-to-be hired chief of planning, and stakeholders across Boston's communities to tie the future of urban renewal to the future we envision collectively as a leading progressive city. It will also give us time to examine who, if anyone, might be harmed by the sunsetting of these remaining urban renewal districts, and to establish plans for mitigating these harms. Ultimately, as Mayor Wu said to this council in the request for this hearing, the future of urban renewal in Boston must be built upon transparency and accountability to community members. We must commit to putting equity at the forefront of planning and development decisions, and we must see urban renewal through this lens. We are certainly looking forward to working with each of you on this important topic and crafting a more equitable, inclusive, and vibrant future for our city. So I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Chris Breen.
Before you move on, Devin and Chris, I apologize. I'm so excited. I haven't chaired a meeting in 3 years. This is my first.
It's good to be here in person.
So we're going to go to opening statements from councilors, the sponsor and the co-sponsor first, and then go around the room. I apologize for that, Devin, but that was a good. That was good for us.
I'll be happy to do it all again if you'd like.
No, that's okay. Thank you. And with that, Kenzie, your opening statement, please. Oh, and we've also been joined by Councilor Worrell.
Great, thank you so much, Cora. Thank you so much to the chair, and thank you to the BPDA for being here. And I'm glad that there's an opportunity today for us to combine this order from the mayor with a hearing order that Councilor Louis-Jean and I had previously filed. This is a topic that I care quite a lot about. In relationship to Devin's remarks, I am the counselor for the West End, which has become a national and frankly international story of the perils of urban renewal and of the kind of like hubris that can lead to destroying a community. And still, I hear all the time from constituents who have both constituents who have managed to stay in Boston or return to Boston, and from folks who grew up in the West End but who lost a home that they never got back. And so, you know, as a historian myself, thinking about that, I think it's incredibly important that the city do what the Wu administration is recommending, in the sense of really turning the page and saying that we need to be thinking differently about the whole relationship that the city and planning have to our neighborhoods. And so I'm very glad that we're here today on that. This hearing is combined with our docket that we filed because at the same time, one of the things that I feel is very urgent for the priorities of this council and the things that the mayor has articulated are that we use public land use tools for the public good. And I say land use tools because it's both about places where we actually own public land and we can do things, but also in some cases there are areas that may not be held by the public, but where the public has a vital interest. And a few examples of this type of thing is places where we could imagine building social housing on public land, but also as we face our climate crisis, places where we might need to assemble fringes along the harbor in order to protect our city, thinking about opportunities to transfer land into land trusts, as was once famously done by the BPDA with urban renewal powers, something that I'll ask about later in this hearing. So for me, I'm coming with a couple of sets of questions today, and I'm grateful to the BPDA for sending over a response, a fairly thick response to a fairly extensive set of questions I sent over before the hearing. Councilors have that, and I know we'll get more into all the details of that. I think what I'm interested in is both making sure that we don't lose anything as we sunset these districts, particularly affordable housing restrictions, but really anywhere that we manage to snag something important for the public good, because it would be a double harm if we both hurt families and communities when we did clearances decades ago in these areas, and then the public goods that we did get, whether they're parks or affordable housing or whatever, we allowed the restrictions to expire. So it's very important to me that we have a considered plan on that front. And then secondly, and I'm really interested in how we think about using these land use tools robustly for the public interest. And so, I will frame some questions in that direction to the BPDA today. I'm also very grateful that we're going to be joined in a second panel after the administration by some advocates thinking about sort of that future of public land use in the city, particularly on the housing front. And while the advocates won't be speaking specifically to the urban renewal tools, I think my hope for this hearing is that we would put kind of the realities and the nitty-gritty that the administration is going to talk about next to our kind of hopes and imaginations for more robust public land use in the city of Boston, and think about ways that we could affect a real transformation in that direction, and also look at the seeds of places where we've used these powers for a significant public good, and think about how we expand that. So those are really my hopes. I will, since the chair isn't here to tell me I've used my time, I will just temporarily add on that on the particular order from the mayor in front of us, I have two very specific issues I want to raise. One of them is that I do think, and the chair alluded to it, that the timing of sunsetting on December 31st of this year puts this body in a particular crunch, because that is when all of our legislation sunsets, actually a couple weeks prior to that. And so I do think that from the council's perspective, it would be better, and I don't think would materially change the request, to bump that out to, say, like March 31st, just so that we can actually process what the administration has processed with greater time. I mean, even this, being today a month out from the deadline is a little close for comfort. So I do hope, Mr. Chair, that we'll discuss an extension of that a little bit today, still keeping it under a year. And then the other thing is just, I've heard from a number of nearby constituents some concern about the Park Plaza plan, and we may be pushing to shift that over into the longer consideration. But it's technically in Councilor Flynn's district, and I'm sure we'll have further discussion. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Block. Councilor Louis-Jean.
Thank you, Chair, for holding this hearing. You look, even though you said you had a 3-year hiatus, you're doing a good job. I also want to thank Kenzie Councilor Block, for allowing me to join her on this docket number 0192. So I'll say my first job here in the city of Boston was at the age of 14, working as a tour guide for an organization called Multicultural Youth Tours of What's Now, when I would walk around the South End and Lower Roxbury and give folks the people-centered history of the city of Boston, and how people came together to stop highways. Southwest Corridor Park was planned to be a highway. I would tell folks about the work of Mel King, who sometimes protested inside the office of BRA to prevent the displacement of folks. And so, as has been alluded to, urban renewal has a very checkered history in our city, but I'm excited to think about ways that we can use, as Councilor Block said, public land for public good. Our public land and public finance are powerful tools, so powerful, in fact, that they carry systemic change with them. They have the potential to change not only the physical landscape, but the broader way we interact with government. This was obviously done poorly with the first iterations of urban renewal, destroying communities in the West End and the South End. Urban renewal is often dubbed Negro removal by the prolific African-American writer James Baldwin for its displacement impact on Black communities. But now, with oversight and influence, we're hoping that the council can learn and really understand how we can continue to use these tools for purposes of community empowerment and engagement, and also community control. We can regulate for community land trusts using DSNI's Dudley Neighbors Community Land Trust model, planning for more civic and green spaces through deed restrictions and ground leases. Urban renewal is premised on the value of large-scale, long-term advancement, ensuring long-term values of public spaces are properly valued. Carolyn Crockett has a great book, People Before Highways. She's the one who founded My Town, my first job, where she talks about the ability of us to really use these tools in a community-driven way to make sure that public land is being responsive to the needs of community members. These long-term public profits could be better schools and more affordable housing. The public should also share in the benefit when the long-term value of private land is utilized by our quasi-government agencies too, like the BHA, BPHC, Massport, Convention Center Bureau, et cetera. So whether it's urban renewal, IDP policy, linkage, master planning, harbor planning, or zoning, we just have to be intentional about what it means for a city to invest in the public good and to do as much as we can to bring the community along and to transfer as much power we can to community control. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to this hearing.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Flaherty?
Hear me? And obviously, thank you to the BRA doing business as the BPDA. That still hasn't been fixed, by the way. We need to have that run through the council for that. But nonetheless, want to thank Devin Quirk, Chris Breen, Eileen Brophy, and Heather Kempson for your work on this. I know that you guys have been analyzing all of these urban renewal plans. On the council, I have the most experience in this space, having extended and sunset a number of them over the years. So I know it's not a new concept. We last dealt with this probably about 6 years ago. It's sunsetting as it pertains to these particular items. Sunsetting those areas have always been part of the discussion and part of the plan. I will say that, and just really more for my colleagues' edification, if we don't vote on sunsetting these, then we actually lose the ability on all of them. And so I think that hopefully Devin or someone will explain kind of how that works. So clearly we have a couple of dockets in front of us here that address sunsetting. It's my understanding that if the council does not take action on those, we actually lose the ability on all of them. And I would caution my colleagues, particularly my district councilors, because they're important tools. And if appropriately used, they can actually do a lot of good in terms of encouraging investment in economic development, job creation, housing, open space protection, and as referenced in the beginning. And I do appreciate Devin acknowledging urban renewal's history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we saw how important it was with the North End Treasure, with that nursing home, and that community was under siege, and working closely with the community leaders, families that had loved ones in the nursing home, and also our district colleague, Councilor Lydia Edwards. We were able to, because of those tools, we were able to save that from demolition, arguably. So, again, make sure that, and also folks need to know that it's not sort of a simple. They're not simple. They're very nuanced. Each one of them is a little bit different. But being able to flush through that, so hopefully that through the chair this hearing, we'll get into maybe be able to dive into some of those nuances. But I think it's important that folks explain kind of how, if we don't act on the sunset, we lose the ability on the others. And I think that there are a couple that are maybe in midstream or have the ability to do some great things in certain districts. So I just want to put that on as a caveat and look forward to further testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Flynn?
Thank you, Councilor. Thank you, Councilor Baker, and thank you, Councilor Bach, and Mayor Wu and the BPDA team for the important work that you're doing here. As we talk about urban renewal and the extensions that this process may take place, we should also talk about the larger theme of how we can use planning for the public goods, such as building more affordable housing, preserving open space, supporting community land trusts. Many of these are in my district, So I want to make sure that there is absolutely no negative impacts that it has on my residents, and that includes, and I've made this clear, I don't want to see one resident displaced because of this, and I know I have a guarantee from the BPDA that that will take place, that will not take place. But I want to make sure that that's noted on the record, that we're able to work with small businesses in the impacted area as well, especially businesses owned by immigrants and communities of color, giving them an opportunity to stay in Boston. You shouldn't just have to be able to be a major company to stay in the city. We need to support our small businesses. The BPDA has tools that can help that. So again, I'm looking forward to the conversation, but I want to make it very clear that this cannot have any negative impact on any of my constituents at all, especially our immigrant residents. In fact, it has to improve their life and address quality of life issues as well. So thank you to the BPDA team, and thank you to you, Councilor Baker, as well.
Thank you. Councilor Anderson? Fernandez-Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually really excited for this hearing and this process. So obviously it's a very emotional one and a very personal one, and I think that we can't necessarily vote or take a position on something that we don't understand. And I believe that thus far the community has expressed time and time again that there should be a moratorium, there should be a slowdown of process of some sort to understand the long-term concept. What is the long-term concept, and how can the city, BPDA, everybody else involved actually guarantee results that are different from what's happened so far? So the overall consensus has been, this is just an excuse to demolish on a large scale, to leverage, to push us out. And all that it does, it creates pain and it kills Black people. Inevitably, I talk a lot about the social determinants of health perpetuated by poverty, perpetuated by urban renewal and everything else that you mentioned earlier. And I just have to say that, again, I don't understand the long-term concept. And I don't think that folks here have demonstrated what that is to the community, or if they have, the community, we didn't get it, we didn't understand it. So I wonder then what is missing, and then if the community process and all that is supposed to support improving this is not working, then what's the problem? Is it performative? Is it just so we can say that we involve the community, we care, we really care? All the beautiful political jargons that we can use couldn't justify what we've done to Black and brown communities. So I'm really excited, because I think that when there's conflict, there's an opportunity for change. And I pray and I hope that the change is going to be a positive one, but I will stand firmly on looking at this with a lens of, let's slow it down if we must, so that we don't have to disproportionately impact people the way we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Worrell?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Councilor Bach and Councilor Louis Jen for sponsoring this hearing. And our city faces many, and thank you for the BPDA for being present and also having conversations about the urban renewal process with me and my staff. Our city faces, many urgent crises, from climate to housing affordability, that requires bold, decisive action from our city. That includes using all tools that are at our disposal to create long-term affordability and address community needs, including green spaces, urban farms, and parks. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel on how we can use these tools to protect our residents. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor. And now we can continue on. Thank you.
I just had one question. We have a PowerPoint. Are people able to see?
Can you identify yourself first, Chris?
Oh, sorry. It's Chris Breen, BPDA Urban Renewal Manager.
Yeah, and you're going to do a PowerPoint
Yeah.
that we'll follow along with you?
Yeah.
And Cora, is the PowerPoint going to pop up?
Screen.
Yes, I think
It's
it's.
up.
So I can this is just the intro page as to why we're here at the City Council.
While we're waiting, I'm going to read this into the record. This is from Councilor Julia Mejia. Dear Mr. Chair and members of the Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation, I'm writing to inform you of my absence from today's hearing on the Committee Planning and Development and Transportation regarding dockets 0314 and 0192. A hearing on docket 0192, order regarding using planning and land use tools for public good, in docket 0314, an order beginning the process of sunsetting urban renewal in the city of Boston until December 31st, 22. Due to a previously scheduled engagement, I am not able to attend. Someone from my office will review the conversations held today and follow up with relevant questions. And there are some questions here, but I'll let her handle those. Thank you. Chris?
Thank you, Councilor. Thank you, City Council, for allowing me to speak. My name is Christopher Breen. I work at the Boston Planning and Development Agency as the Urban Renewal Manager. The first screen is essentially your title screen. We are at the City Council hearing, and the subject matter is the extension request for 9 of the 14 urban renewal plans. As sort of Devin alluded to, just to sort of hammer it home, the current proposal sunsets 5. Those 5 plant areas are in blue on the map to your right, and it asks for an extension of 9 urban renewal plan areas up until around December 31st.
Chris, I only count 4.
There's
Brunswick King, Kittredge Square, Park Plaza, and,
Boylston, Essex is so small that you won't be able to see it really.
oh, okay, it's right in there. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Next slide. So this next slide is kind of where I come in, sort of when I joined the agency a few years back. So my name is Chris, and I took on the job as community engagement and urban renewal manager for the BPDA. So basically this slide is a recap of the work that's done since the last extension of urban renewal in 2016. The bulk of that work is encapsulated in the Boston City Council's Urban Renewal Action Plan. You can see that in the upper left-hand corner. The action plan is a request for the BPDA to take on a series of transparency measures, procedural changes, and document and data collection tasks. Those tasks included the creation of an Urban Renewal Document Center that's now publicly available on our website. And that document center has, for public consumption, you can download any plan, urban renewal plan, any modification from that plan, and any map of the area to just have the average person sort of, who may not know anything about urban renewal other than the West End, just allow them to sort of read through that information, because Boston is so much more than just the West End experience. We also updated our progress across 6 city council check-ins over the years. We completed a land disposition agreement inventory, and we also did a BPDA-owned property inventory. And we conducted over 20 community meetings specifically regarding urban renewal, in which we talked about all those things. We talked about the history of urban renewal, we talked about the tools and what they meant, and we talked about land disposition agreements, where they were and how they affected individual parcels in individual plan areas. So we went out to every single area, and we went out twice a couple times. Next slide. Throughout the course of that work, we discovered a whole heck of a lot. We discovered that there are over 1,500 parcels of land by assessing ID in the city of Boston that were created from urban renewal tools. This discovery indicated to us that there are nearly 10,000 income-restricted units created by urban renewal, not unlike the 500 units seen on the top left square, located at Castle Square in the South End. Many of those income-restricted units consisted of elderly housing, another important land use. Nearly 200 units were located at the Bunty Apartments in Roxbury in the upper middle on the top row. Additionally, we found hundreds of residential and commercial rehabilitation and preservation projects, just like the ones you see at the Mercantile buildings across the street in the North End. And many, many others can be found throughout the city in my hometown of Charlestown, also in South End and Roxbury. We also found many community and cultural spaces like the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center and various other public art displays, cultural monuments, and institutional spaces in the lower left there, represented by the photo in the lower left. We also discovered over 200 open space restricted spaces consisting of community gardens and many other large parks, backyards, side yards, and some small resident parking parcels behind people's homes in Fenway, Roxbury, South End, and Charlestown. Lastly, we found dozens of public facilities that were created with urban renewal tools, just like Charlestown High School and its associated playfields. We also found dozens and dozens of libraries, police and fire stations, community centers, and schools, all related to urban renewal on urban renewal parcels and urban renewal plan areas, particularly these 14 up for debate. In total, we uploaded over 15,000 documents attached to these parcels and attached to these parcels and others that detail massive infrastructure improvement done to the city and its sewer systems that helped jumpstart private investment in the 1960s and onwards. Next slide. The completion of the action plan and the analysis of the LDA inventory and BPDA property inventory resulted in 2 reports to DHCD that ultimately recommended a staggered sunset of urban renewal in Boston starting this month, a month from today, on April 22nd, 2022. This initial report in 2019 that was sent to DHCD recommended the potential sunsetting of the 5 urban renewal areas before you today. The 2021 report, the follow-up report, recommended 4 of the 5, but over the past year, we've looked at Brunswick King, that 5th land area parcel, and we've now added it back into the category of potentially being sunset. DHCD and the council at the time wanted a timeline to sunset these parcels, and we felt like with the 2 letters, we did our jobs. We selected plan areas that could sunset, and we selected other plan areas that maybe need just a little bit more time to eventually sunset. And each of them have their own specific reason why they need extra time. How did we even choose the 5? Well, the recommendation for sunset formula kind of goes like this. First, we looked at the number of urban renewal related actions taken since 2016 in this plan area. Is this an active area? Is it not? If you're not taking a lot of actions, it's probably not an active area. Then we looked at the planning context of each neighborhood. Basically, do we need this plan for a project upcoming in the future, or do we not really see anything coming at us in the horizon? Then we looked at regulatory controls that are in place. We looked at how many LDAs there are in each area. That played a really important part. Obviously, the more LDAs you have, the more risk you have of losing something that's important to someone, and we don't want that to happen. Lastly, we looked at the development status of each parcel that we owned. We looked at those parcels and we tried to figure out, is it difficult to develop this parcel, or can we do it without having to use our urban renewal tools? And we sort of took that formula and mixed it into a pot and came out with an answer, and the answer was those 5 areas you see before you. Next slide. one more slide, sorry. That's for the stuff I was talking about. And then here are the 5 areas that we have now suggested and now proposed could potentially sunset in April. They are Central Business District, Boylston, Essex, downtown. School Franklin, downtown. Park Plaza, downtown. Kittredge Square, Roxbury. Brunswick King, Dorchester. Next slide. Quick analysis of those 5. We'll start with the easiest. Boylston, Essex. Boylston, Essex, if you don't know where it is or what it is, consists of a building known as the Commonwealth Center, or previously known as the Commonwealth Center back in the day. It contains a CVS, a Boston Common Moving Theater, a Ritz-Carlton. Basically, we acquired a small area on the map in sort of Peach and helped to get that development sort of off the ground using our tools in that small area, because there's a number of easements below. The MBTA was, doing new lines, train lines in the late 60s. So we acquired the parcel and helped sort of move that project forward, and that building is now restricted to, typical office space uses that you see in there, and commercial uses that you see in there, and the MBTA built their subway, and that was kind of it. Next slide. The analysis of the area, we looked at how many properties do we own? We own no properties in Boylston, Essex. How many restrictions do we have? We have 1 LDA, and that covers 1 assessing parcel. How many actions did we take in 6 years? We took 1 action, and that 1 action was to debate on whether or not we should sunset this area. The community feedback, when I went out and had a meeting, basically we, the BPDA, recommended to the community, gave them advance notice that this could be an area that we would suggest to sunset. Next slide. We're going to move on to School Franklin. If you don't know where School Franklin is, it's on School Street and Franklin Street. But if you don't know where that is, it's near Old City Hall. And that's also an urban renewal parcel that most people don't realize because it's old. Also, urban renewal parcels and projects out there would be the Irish Famine Memorial, the community cultural space. Shoppers Park, the recently redesigned sort of public open space, is an urban renewal parcel. And the parcels that have LDAs would be, I believe it's TJ Maxx. TJ Maxx, I don't go there that often anymore, but my mother loves the home goods. And then there's also an old bank, which I call it the Borders. When I used to buy CDs, I don't think people do that anymore. But it's now a Walgreens, I believe, and it still exists today. That parcel, we own only a small piece of it. Again, it's almost similar to Boylston, Essex, where the parcel that we controlled, that we put the LDA on, is kind of on the old bank side. And it's developed, and that's just kind of where we're at with it. Our analysis of School Franklin, we own 2 parcels left: Old City Hall, Irish Famine, totally good. We have 2 LDAs. That covers 4 IDs. I know that might not make sense, but the 2 LDAs can cover 4 assessing IDs because, those assessing IDs are built for something, and they're owned by usually mutual people. And so it's 1 LD that covers this one LD that covers that. And the number of actions taken, again, only 2 actions taken. The community feedback, when I went out there, they did not express a strong preference to either sunset or renew, at least the second time. The first time they were interested in, learning about the tools and were concerned, but the second time we went out there, there was no major pushback for School Franklin. Next slide. Gets a little more interesting. We have Park Plaza, also downtown. You might know it from the China Trade Building, the recently rehabbed China Trade Building over the many decades. it's at a high occupancy, I believe. So Park Plaza, in the map below, you see all the properties that the BPDA, then BRA acquired in blue and developed for a specific reason in hand with the neighborhood council of the area. In red, you'll see the property we still own and we still take pride in owning it, the China Trade Building. Below that, next slide, our reason for allowing it to sunset. Well, we only own one parcel and it's pretty developed. We have 6 LDAs, and that cuts across multiple assessing IDs because I know there's lots of condo owners in the Park Plaza area and some of the larger buildings, but there are 6 LDA buildings that control things like height, FAR use, design. The actions taken, we've only taken 2 actions on Park Plaza in 6 years, which that's not too many. The community feedback we received, we did recommend sunsetting the plan at the most recent community meeting. We had 2 community meetings. The first one, I would say, folks were a little mixed opinion. Some wanted to keep it, some didn't, because they take a lot of pride of their area, and they felt it's developed relatively well because it was developed with the community in hand, certainly during the 70s. But, you know, we are tasked with looking at places that could sunset, and certainly Park Plaza is one to discuss. Next slide. Brunswick King. This plan is most noted for its open space and its public facilities. You might know about Children's Park, which is a City of Boston park, seen in the photo. That was originally an urban renewal parcel. You might know about Ceylon Park, of which many parcels were originally urban renewal parcels taken from, I believe, foreclosed homes in the area. You might know about MLK Playground, and you might know about some residential open side yards where people sort of park their car or they sit out with their family and have picnics along their home. Next slide. So that analysis was a little different. We looked at how many properties we own, and this was a really big important part of it for me and us. We saw that we owned 2 parcels, and the community was very excited about potentially using those 2 parcels to build something that's great for a community good. The restrictions, we had 6 assessing IDs that had 6 LDAs. They're mostly open space restrictions. Just not a lot of development in the area. We looked at the actions taken, another 6. We took 6 actions, and I think a lot of that was to dispose of some of the properties that are in the area, because we were prepping to maybe look at this to sunset or expire. Next up, Kittredge Square. Kittredge Square is known for its rehabbed and renovated brownstones, I would say. The photo you see here is 7 Alva Kittredge. There are not only just renovated homes, there are new homes for low and moderate income folks like the Highland Park Estates too. But predominantly you have lots of rehabilitation projects on parcels 8 and parcel 8A, as well as a number of community gardens along Highland Street, and then another one along Cedar Street. Basically for this one, we own 3 parcels. Oh, wait to get to this. On this one, next slide, we own 3 parcels. The restrictions are 28 land disposition agreement restrictions over 83 individual assessing parcels. A lot of those are sort of tight together buildings that cover one LDA. We've taken 6 actions since 2016, so not a significant amount. Our community feedback was the most important aspect of this one, and the folks at Kittredge Square were the most supportive of a potential sunset of the plan rather than some of the other community meetings that I've attended. I will say about the parcels we own, 2 of them are within a community garden. We're working very hard to give them to the community garden, so it's theirs formally. And the 3rd one abuts a guy's house, but the elevation is at such that it may only be proper for a side yard. But we'll go to the next slide. But those are just the 5. There's a lot more left. There's 9 planned areas left, and this is when everything gets confusing. We have Campus High School in Roxbury. We have Charlestown. We have downtown waterfront, Faneuil Hall. You might know it as the North End. We have Fenway. We have Government Center, where we live right now. We have South Cove. You might know it as Chinatown. You have South End, and South End can extend on into Lower Roxbury. We have South Station, which is self-explanatory, and we have Washington Park, which is a large swath of area in Roxbury. And we can go to the next slide. To give you an up-close look at those areas and see all of the complications and all of the land use restrictions on those. Basically, all the different butterfly colors you see there on those parcels are all urban renewal parcels that all have individual restrictions. So in those areas, Campus High School to the left, Charlestown to the upper middle, downtown waterfront to your right, Fenway down below to the left, Government Center, center bottom, and South Cove right bottom. Then you go into the bigger ones, you have the South End, you start with the South End left to right, lots of restrictions, lots of affordability restrictions there. And you have South Station, lots of questions there about the South Station air rights projects, potential climate resiliency issues. And then to your far right, you have Washington Park, an area that still maintains a lot of BPDA-owned parcels and properties that could be developed for community goods that I know Devin's working really hard on. Next slide. This is kind of our final slide, but we do have others if people have in-depth questions. Basically, our next steps are pretty frequent. So the immediate next step, we would need an extension vote from our board, the BPDA board, and then from you, the Boston City Council. And we would take those recommendations and submit the final plan to DHCD, who oversees us. If that works out okay, during the longer extension, we would love to discuss and determine appropriate timelines for sunsetting remaining urban renewal plan areas and to develop a plan to consider the continued protections provided by these land disposition agreements that are very important to the electeds and very important to the folks that live in the neighborhood. And that's kind of, next slide, that's all I have for this part of the presentation. If you guys want to ask questions.
Thank you, Chris. Do ladies need to weigh in at all? Do you have any presentations or here for questions?
No, just questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. I guess I'll start. Chris, so like you went through like we talked about LDAs. Can you give us a breakdown a little bit about maybe, School Franklin, we'll start there. There's 2 LDAs and 2 parcels. What are the LDAs and what are the 2 parcels? And like if we can go right down Park Plaza, 6 LDAs, 1 parcel, Brunswick King, 2 parcels, 6 LDAs.
School Franklin's LDA, like for the one that's a Walgreens. It's a Walgreens currently. It used to be a Borders.
Yeah.
The LDA is only on a portion of that building. I'm not quite sure why it's only on a portion of the building. I think that at the time the building was not in great shakes and we sort of stepped in and acquired a portion of it to help rehabilitate it, to help restore it. So we put an LDA on the entire property for commercial uses, pretty vague, sort of broad uses. I'll get you the actual LDA language. I believe it's commercial open.
Yeah. Council Box says we have it. So the LDAs are basically where your open space lands, your affordable housing lands, and any other sort of benefit that would come back to us, the community, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Public interest.
Okay, so, well, then maybe instead of kind of going through that, I think if you can come back to us with the parcels that are within these places and a breakdown of what all the LDAs, Brunswick King, 2 parcels and 6 LDAs, Kittredge, 3 parcels, 28 LDAs. So those 28 LDAs, I'm assuming, are mostly affordable housing?
They are. They are, and again, we investigated them. We went through them with a pretty fine tip comb. We partnered with the Mayor's Office of Housing, and we feel pretty confident that even though it's 28 LDAs, that not all those LDAs have affordable housing. A lot of them for like rental rehab projects to sort of reinvigorate the area, open space and stuff like that. But the ones that do have affordability, that I've reviewed, that we've reviewed as a team, most of the restrictions extend beyond 2022. Most of them extend beyond 2030, which was the maximum number of years we were going to ask for an extension anyways. It was the most thought we could get. There was one parcel in question where the LDA ended in 2022, but thanks to Eileen, she found a separate covenant that extended it for 30 years beyond to 2052, right, Eileen?
Yeah, I don't know if this is on, but.
Yeah, you're good there.
Oh, here we go. So when you place a land disposition agreement on a property, it's usually for affordable housing, it's usually accompanied by a covenant for affordable housing.
Yeah.
The covenant is governed by a separate statute. So the term of the covenant would be 30 years plus an additional 20 years for that restriction for affordable housing. So if the LDA goes away, presumably the covenant remains in place because it's in the title to the property and it restricts the affordability. It just, when that term ends, the LDA has gone and we don't have any further interaction with that property.
So we would be unable to, at that point, remain...
At the end of the 50 years, that it would, if that property changed and came in for redevelopment, it would have to go under some other program like IDP or something if there was, a development that was subject to that.
So without the LDA, we potentially run the risk of losing affordable housing?
Eventually,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, but that's the design of the program. I mean, it was always intended to be for a limited period of time, and by statute, the affordability covenants are restricted to a certain period of time. We don't have like in perpetuity affordability
Yeah.
through the
yeah.
BPD, through the VRA.
So if you can explain a little bit, like covenants we know with affordable housing, the covenants with the owner or the builder or whatever, that's how we would protect housing after the LDA is no longer, we're no longer able to use it. How would we protect open space or some of the other benefits that come with the LDAs?
So open space restrictions are put into the deeds to the property and in the land disposition agreements that went with the property. If they did, not all open space property that was conveyed went with the land disposition agreement. So the position would be that the deed restricts the property for that use. There is a further process with the state to strengthen that open space restriction, or through the Parks Department or something. Those parcels are not necessarily fully restricted that way, but most of them were given to organizations whose mission it is to maintain that.
Like the Parks Department or
Yeah, the trustees of reservations, or, you know, they were intentionally given to people whose mission it is to maintain open space use.
Okay. When was the last extension? Was it 6 years ago when we had that?
2016.
And my last question is, how much land, how many parcels, do we have a number of parcels that the BPDA owns now that doesn't have, that could potentially be either developed for open space, or like how much land is basically left? Yeah.
We currently own, we currently own 235 parcels, but that includes both our land leased inventory, so in the, we have, for example, Old City Hall in the, in the School of Franklin, is a property we own, but it's already fully developed and in a sort of final end use. I don't have the number broken down by urban renewal district for you right now. We can certainly get that for you, but the, it's less than 100 parcels that are undeveloped vacant land within urban renewal
Okay,
districts.
and are they mostly, where are they in?
We're working, as Chris mentioned, we work very hard on this. It's incredibly important to us to develop public land for public good. And, you know, they range from a small, single-family home lot in a residential neighborhood. The example in Brunswick King is a good example of that, all the way up to, in the Campus High urban renewal area, we have parcel P3, which is the very largest parcel in our inventory, something we are incredibly dedicated to developing in the public interest, and that's over 7 acres of land. Can do a
Parcel
lot of
3,
great-
that's the one on Tremont Street
Yeah,
there?
exactly.
Okay, and I know I just said last question, but last question is for the old City Hall, that's a long-term lease with Synergy, I guess. So does that money from that lease go in for your operating budget for BPDA? Like, is that how, so what you own and you collect rent on, does that go towards BPDA operations?
As a general answer, you're absolutely right that we, in general, take our land lease revenue, and that's what funds the agency. We take no tax dollars in the city of Boston. We have plenty of examples of property where we have a either greatly below market ground rent or a $0 ground rent to support community development uses, and then of course we have uses outside of our urban renewal area, like in the Marine Park and that CDIC property, where we have market rate uses that really are the engine of funding the BPDA. In the case of Old City Hall is a unique example because that was really a city. I mean, that was City Hall. It was a city building, so the revenues from that, we have the land lease, the revenues for that are dedicated back to the city.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Bach?
Great, thanks so much, Councilor Baker. And I would just note for colleagues that in the back of the packet connected to the information request, there's a list of every land disposition agreement attached to these 5. So if people have a chance to, if you're wondering about those, we're grateful to the BPDA for providing those. And then on the second page of that info request, it kind of gives a count of how many are attached to the 9 that are up for extension. I guess on the affordable housing LDA front, I do think it would be helpful. I'm absolutely going to defer to Councilor Fernandez-Anderson on the Kittredge Square question, but I know that for me in the Fenway district, the big concern has precisely been that a whole bunch of the remaining LDAs are affordable housing, and it's not clear to me that all of those have that kind of like duplicate restriction, such that if we remove the BPDA ones, there's something else holding. Because I think basically, I mean, although it doesn't go on forever, what I took to be the gist of your comment was that for most of the ones in Kittredge Square, you lift the BPDA, LDA, and there's still a D&D deed restriction sitting there, or some other, or a BHA restriction or whatever. And so if you guys could speak to that, so we understand that. And I do think that, although it wasn't in the info request, getting confirmation that for each of the affordable parcels in Kittredge Square, since I think it's the only one where affordable housing is mentioned, that there is like a second stopgap thing. But also if you could just speak a little bit more to that issue, because I mean, from my perspective, as I think about why I'm glad that that we're talking about extending Fenway as part of the short term, it really is that issue. So could You guys just.
I'll start and maybe turn it over to Eileen, who can speak in more legal detail. But I think, in general, Councilor Brock, what you're hitting on there is exactly the distinction between the 5 that we're proposing to sunset and the 9 that we are suggesting we need some additional time, because we need to take the time to do the thorough research so we can come to this council and say, we've looked at every parcel in the Fenway, or every parcel in South Cove, or every parcel in the South End. Those are renewal districts which have many, many, many more LDAs, and will take more time to get to that level of confidence that we're at for Kitchard Square, for Brunswick King, and the 3 downtown parcels where we're very confident there's not going to be unintended consequences and loss of affordability. But turn it over to Eileen to talk about Kitchard Square in particular.
Did I get it?
Yeah. Lights on.
Thank you. So there is a bit of a distinction. Some of the land disposition agreements were with individual property owners. So by agreement with them, there was a covenant placed on the units that were being created in that project. So when those units were conveyed, there was a covenant that was signed by the person who bought that unit, that was put on by the developer. And those are the traditional 30-year covenants under, the statute with the 20-year extension. And that is not something that's also protected by another BHA or D&D, or that, those are individual agreements with property owners that happened at the time that property was being developed. There are in other areas, the intersection of urban renewal intervention plus BHA housing plus D&D financing that all came together to create multiple layers of protection for property. So those are the types of things that we'd probably want to drill down on and say, once urban renewal goes away here, that intervention is over in the future, but it's also BHA housing, or it's a 121A project, because that's another thing that intersects with urban renewal often. And so those are the types of things that have extended protections outside of just BRA, urban renewal, LDA.
And following up on the affordable housing front, can you guys talk a little bit about, it was something, it's on the 3rd page of the info request. I did ask, I asked you all this, but I was wondering if we could talk a little bit in the hearing about the way in which the BPDA uses these urban renewal powers to acquire land for not for public, but for often affordable, often social housing. And specifically, I just want to confirm that with the 5 districts that we're talking about today, sunsetting, we don't feel like there are major opportunities for affordable housing development. Because you guys have talked about, the BPDA-owned parcels and whether any of those need action, and you've talked about the land disposition agreements and whether we're losing anything, and I agree those are 2 of the important things. But it does seem like a 3rd important criteria is that it not be a place where there's a major opportunity to develop affordable housing, because you guys do have these tools that make it a little bit easier than some of the city's other mechanisms. So I just wonder if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think that Chris went through the lens of how we viewed when we were making the decision whether or not to recommend sunsetting. And I think it really is, to echo what you're saying, Councilor Bach, it's both backward-looking, what are we going to lose in terms of protections and unintended consequences and individuals who might be harmed, but also forward-looking, how might we want to use these tools based on the current reality and how tools are used today. So a couple good examples of how we've recently used the acquisition power that the BPDA has. And so one important thing to realize about the BPDA's ability to acquire property is we're not limited by the city of Boston's limitation on acquiring property for municipal use. We can acquire property for economic development purposes. We can acquire property for affordable housing development purposes. The city can, of course, acquire property for schools and libraries, but also has to go through a competitive RFP process. We, if we choose to, can act more like a private actor in the real estate market and to negotiate directly with sellers of land to acquire property. A good example of that recently is in Roslindale on Walter Street. We acquired 2 parcels that were privately owned. The owner wanted to sell rapidly. It was a vacant home and a piece of property next to a wetland. The Parks Department really wanted to acquire this to preserve the access to the wetlands and bring that into it was on their priority list for acquisition of property for conservation purposes. But if they acquired it, they wouldn't be able to create any housing there. They could only acquire it for conservation purposes. Sheila Dillon's team at the Mayor's Office of Housing was very interested in acquiring that house for affordable housing. So we acted as agent for the city to purchase the property and then bifurcate it into 2 properties. One went to the Conservation Commission to permanently conserve it as wetlands access. The other, we are in the process of disposing it to Habitat for Humanity, who's going to do 3 affordable housing units there. So a unique example of how our tools can be helpful in a more limited and a socially minded way. We're doing a very similar project in Upham's Corner where we've acquired some property and are moving forward with a plan to develop affordable housing in a new Upham's Corner branch library. That's a mix of uses for acquisition that would be very hard for the city to do. So those are tools we want to hang on to and think about the right way to apply them in the future of urban renewal. And there's lots of avenues to do that. We should have that discussion over the course of the 9-month extension. But to answer your question directly about the 5 that are expiring, we don't see an immediate need for using those acquisition tools or an opportunity to use those tools and to advance an affordable housing use or a community development use directly in those districts.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I'll just stress for new counselors and other folks that the council actually, really led moving another $20 million into the acquisition opportunity program that the city has over at D&D in the last budget cycle. And it's super important to me in this moment where the private side on housing just is seeing insane rental and value increases, that the city be able to take those rapid actions where we act as a buyer. And so I think folks don't always know that the point that you raised, Devin, that the city can only acquire land for purely municipal purposes, but that you're sort of the arm that we can use to acquire land for something like housing. And I just want to stress that it was very important to the council to put that money in because we're really trying to say, hey, how do we grab some of this land and pull it off the private market and stabilize our communities with housing? And so I really want to make sure that we don't lose the tools to effectively do that because the money's not going to do us any good if we can't acquire things. So just really want to stress that point, but I take the point on these 5. I know that there's lots of councilors waiting to ask questions, so I'll just say also on the direct negotiation front that, and I'll let Councilor Flynn address it more directly, but it does concern me. I've been very proud, although it's not my district, but I grew up like a stone's throw away. I've been very proud of the way that the China Trade Building has been dealt with recently, and not just the siting of the temporary Chinatown library there, but also the ability to keep some of those small businesses in there. And I think the fact that we are not doing a sort of who can give us the most rent process and you guys are just directly negotiating with some of those people has been really fruitful for that community resource. So I just want to stress that that's a thing that that's part of the reason why my instinct is that Park Plaza we should give it a little more time to figuring out. But I'll let Councilor Flynn ask more of the questions about that.
You're good?
Yes, I'm good for now. I'm gonna probably have a
Yeah,
couple
we'll come
more
back.
in a second,
I know you have more. Councilor Louisiane?
Thank you. Just a few questions. Thank you. Just a few questions. So just so that I understand the process here, so these LDAs expire, BPDA still owns the land for all of them and is still collecting rent from all these properties.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything?
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. What happens, practically speaking, if you can walk me through, what happens if we allow all of them to expire and not just the ones that we're okay to have sunset? What practically will happen?
And I certainly think Eileen should opine on this as well, but I think what we're most concerned about is it's sort of there's the backward-looking and the forward-looking. The backward-looking is there are well over 1,000 LDAs, and we need to invest the time to ensure that a unit of housing is not, a affordable housing unit is not lost, that the only thing protecting it if the only thing protecting it is an LDA and urban renewal expires on April 22nd, then that affordable housing unit is no longer protected. Now, lots of affordable housing units have lots of other protections, and like we've already mentioned, they may be owned by the BHA. We don't have to worry about those. The same can be true. Same can be said about open space restrictions. Some open space restrictions are protected by ownership, the Parks Department. Some open space restrictions are protected by zoning, but that's not true of all of them. So what we think the council deserves, but certainly the residents of Boston deserve, is for us to be able to speak with authority on if this urban renewal district goes away, this is who might be harmed, and this is what we might be able to do about it. We are very prepared and able to say that about the 5 we're proposing to expire. We're not in a position to be able to say that about the remaining 9, and that's what we need to take the next 9 months to do.
I just want to make a clarification quickly about in the urban renewal areas where we actually still own the parcels, those are still in our ownership, and we're still figuring out what to do with development there. Anything that has a land disposition agreement on it has been transferred to another person. By definition, the disposition has happened. So when that LDA goes away, we don't own that land anymore. That's in the private ownership. The covenants that are on it might protect the affordability that was created when it was disposed of. But once those covenants expire, then that land is in the ownership of the person it was disposed to, and we don't have any more interaction with that. It's not that, LDAs come back to us or we're still collecting rent on those properties, or that's not, it by definition was a disposition to an individual.
So the LDAs actually, once they expire, we know there's no longer ownership with the BPDA?
No.
No.
Okay.
Yes,
I mean,
that
there's
was your
no
question.
ownership even with the LDA in place. The ownership has been transferred. It's like any other encumbrance, that you place on your property, but you own it yourself. But there's a beneficial covenant that goes back to us. Once that expires, the property is in the ownership of the person it was transferred to, and it stays there.
And Councilor, in your packet, there's a list of LDAs by urban renewal district that we're extending. There are 731 LDAs in those 9 districts that we're extending, and there are 235 BPDA-owned properties in those districts that we're extending. Those are mutually exclusive, so those are two different sets of property.
Okay. Another follow-up is, could we have done any of these projects in the urban renewal areas without using our urban renewal powers in its entirety? And what would that have looked like?
I think that's a hard question to answer in the general, right? But I think there are certainly projects where the city of Boston, had it been a city of Boston property, could have accomplished the same outcome. I used to work for the Mayor's Office of Housing. We certainly did a lot of public land disposition for affordable housing. So the answer to that is yes in some cases, but then the examples I used about acquisition, no, we could not have accomplished that without a pathway to exempt ourselves from Chapter 30B, which the BPDA is exempt from for real estate decisions, but the city is not.
And then one last question that dovetails off of the previous question that I asked. Do you have an example of a property where of the ones that where you're seeking to have continued, are there any can you give an example of one where the only restriction is the LDA and there's no covenant that runs with the land, there's no other encumbrance, there's nothing else, and what's preserving affordability is just that LDA?
Yeah, that's a fair one. You did press the button, Chris.
Sorry.
There you go. You're good. Nope. We're all getting used to the mics.
I still don't know how to use these things. So.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I was a Charlestown liaison a long time ago. Try not to remember about it. I hosted a meeting. It was supposed to be a ZBA. I thought it was a ZBA meeting going to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Vacant lot, one guy wants to put a single family there. I hosted the night strategically because there was a big Hood Park meeting occurring on the other side of town, which is really 300-foot building, not too far from us. So I was like, well, everyone will go there. No one will come to my meeting. So my meeting had about 52 people show up, and the Hood Park meeting had about 16. And what I learned is, and this was before I worked here, that there's this thing called urban renewal. And the urban renewal, it was an agreement signed many decades ago by people that have long since passed, that the parcel in question would remain open space for a yard, parking if possible, but mostly for a yard and for the enjoyment of the 4 condo units that abut it. A developer was not aware of the LDA or thought it had expired, purchased it, and started kicking out tenants in front of him or behind him because they were like, oh no, we love this little patio. I came in, I was like, well, you know, there is this restriction on the parcel. We may restrict it, but you need to go through a community process. And he was just like, I have to go through a community process. And we had one public meeting, 25 people showed up, signatures, no way, this isn't happening. And I just went, you're gonna keep that open space restriction, sorry. And he was not happy. And maybe that's a really small project. He wanted to do a single family outright, but it upset a lot of neighborhood folks. Their views, their light, their air, another car into the street, it's very tight in that sort of block of Charlestown. And it happened again in Charlestown, and it happened again in Charlestown. It happened about 3 or 4 times in Charlestown, all these vacant lots, and I was going on Zillow, they're all LDAs. And eventually, the mortgager would reach out to me, and I'd go through the same process. That as an LDA, we're open to a community process, and once they heard that, never heard from them again.
So it's a promise between the purchaser of the property and the BRA, and the only way to enforce that promise, in this case open space, is the LDA. The LDA goes away, there's no more enforcement of that promise. Under zoning, that lot could be developed, that lot would have been developed. On the affordable housing front, I'm struggling to come up with a specific example of this, but I will get you one. But I think that in general, the concept is a lot of affordable housing units in Boston are either built on BHA property. BHA will obviously protect them, or they were built with subsidies from the Mayor's Office of Housing. Those subsidies carry restrictions with them, so even if the LDA went away, the Mayor's Office of Housing still has a covenant or a mortgage on the property that could serve as additional insurance. The place where we have the most risk is where there are smaller unit developments that were built by a small developer or or a homeowner, a rental property, and a 2-family, for example, because they may not have needed any subsidies or the land was sold to them at a reduced cost. And that was the only subsidy provided. So the only thing enforcing that LDA is an agreement between the BPDA and the property owner. Those are the ones where we really need to do the most research on to figure out how to protect them.
Thank you. I'd be, once that research is ready, I'd be happy to take a look at who those are, what neighborhoods those are in, what demographics, because I think that it may also parallel with, you know, what is considered naturally occurring affordable housing, and so what it looks like, what does it look like once the LDAs are gone. It would be interesting to see the concentration in what specific neighborhood, so thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Flynn? Flaherty, rather, I'm sorry. It was Flaherty first, sorry. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eileen, just a quick question. Just bring me through that process when a covenant expires on the affordable side. So the owner of the property then is notified that the covenant no longer exists, and then that person is allowed to sell that unit at a market rate when they've been the beneficiary of sort of an affordable unit. Is that what's?
Essentially.
Yes. Hold on one second.
I don't know if my
There you go,
face is
yeah.
projecting.
It's when it's like fully red that you like, I learned
It's hard
that.
to see from this
Yeah.
angle. Anyway, so when the covenant expires by its terms, there's no more affordability restriction on that property. It's not even a notice. It's just by the terms of the covenant, it ends, and then that unit is unrestricted from that point on.
And the average covenant is 15 years? 50?
Yeah, 30 years, and then an opportunity to extend it for an additional 20.
So given that we're having this discussion about sunsetting and extensions or not extending, does that sort of create, for example, there's 9 plans and there's over 700 LDAs. Does that set up a situation where folks paying attention, they can go secure a property because they know the LDA is going to be expiring in, say, 8 months, and then they sit there and they make a deal with someone and then they sell it on the open market and make a score?
I think that, yes, it creates an opportunity for that type of behavior.
Right, so on a predatory side, we obviously as a council, and obviously the BRA doing business as the BPDA, I think we need to be cognizant of that, particularly in this environment where the economy is, but also because of where the housing costs are. And then, and this isn't my first rodeo with this stuff here. So, and I'm going to be frank, I don't think it's realistic that, so the sunsetting piece, you got me, I'm on board with. The extension for only 8 months when this panel has to review 9 plans and over 700 LDAs, it's just not realistic, Devin. So I'm just going to give it to you straight because I've seen this movie before. And then what happens is in the 8 months, you come in for another extension. So through the chair, I think we need to have a very frank conversation for the benefit of the public as to realistically how long is that going to take? Because I know it's going to take a hell of a lot longer than 8 months to review 9 plans and over 700 LDAs. Those are the facts. Plus, we've got covenants expiring where people are in affordable situations that then they're going to get flipped out of them. So let's be very frank here. Is that, do you need 2 years to do that? Or 3 years to do that? Because I know 8 months is, that's a crock. So we're in a public hearing. We're asking this body to make decisions about sunsetting and about the potential to extend. You know and I know that 8 months is not going to cut the mustard to review 9 other plans and 700 proposals. So I don't want the council being played here, only to have to revisit this in 8 months and then get another 8-month extension, another 8 months. So what is the period? What is the amount of time that you need, honestly, so that this body can go to work and give you the ability to analyze and to investigate all of these? I don't want, and Council Flynn had alluded to it, he doesn't want anyone in his, I'm sure my district colleagues don't want anyone in their districts being displaced. If we're going to start to play a 6-8 month game, people are going to be displaced. I don't want that to happen. If you need 2 years, ask for 2 years. If you need 14 months, ask for 14 months. If you need 3 years, ask for 3 years. Just tell us what you need to do a thorough analysis of all 9 plans and all 700 LDAs, and we'll work with you. I just don't want to be in this game. And again, prior to you coming here, I've dealt with a couple of your predecessors. I'm the longest serving council here in terms of these LDAs and through urban renewal. And as I referenced, I've seen the movie before. I've seen the movie before.
Yeah.
So having some historical knowledge on it, I know, you know, everybody here knows it's going to take a hell of a lot longer than 8 months to get this work done. Tell us how much time you need through the chair and the lead sponsors. Let's noodle through what that time frame is, and let's work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely, Councilor. And I want to echo the point about working together. That's why we're here. We absolutely want to work together with the council on this. We absolutely want to take the council's direction on in shaping the future of our city. And I just want to go back to the point made in the opening statement about accountability and transparency. What we would hate to do is ask for a huge amount of time just to make us feel very comfortable that we would have all the time in the world to do all the research in the world, and then have no transparency and accountability about what that actual work looks like. So and I think working closely with the administration, felt that it was appropriate for us to set a short-term deadline so that everyone can hold us accountable to showing results, to coming back here with analysis and making progress. If we find that there are lots of affordable housing units, for example, at risk, I do not think that we will be able to fully resolve that in 8 months, and we may need other solutions.
Yes.
And we may need further extensions. And that in the mayor's transmission to the city council asking for this hearing, I think she was transparent that further extensions may be necessary. But I think we just want to be cautious about not kicking the can down the road forever.
Right.
We want to be responsive. We want to be communicative.
Mayor, and through the chair, given my experience, there will be requests for extensions. So why don't we just step off and be honest and say, why don't we give you a 2-year extension with 6-month check-ins through the committee chair? Every 6 months, you guys come in and give Councilor Baker and his committee an update as to where you are. I would prefer that than to sort of have this kind of this little cat and mouse thing. That's just, again, my experience on it is that I know you know it's going to take longer than 8 months. Let's just call it what it is. Let's give you guys the time to do what you guys need to do for the plans and for the LDAs. It's important work.
Yeah.
And it's thorough analysis. In this whole process, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's very nuanced. And every time you look around a corner or a building, there's something else, and then you got to worry about. So it's intricately involved with many pieces. So again, I just want to have a very frank and honest conversation through the chair. It ain't going to be 8 months, Councilor Baker.
Yeah.
Let's just put it on the table. And so let's find out a more realistic timeline. I would suggest 2 years with 6-month check-ins through the chair and through the committee, working with the lead sponsors and district councilors who have these in their districts. That would be my 2 cents based on my experience and, again, having seen this movie before. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to representatives from the BPDA for being here today.
Yeah, if I can speak to that a little bit. Council Flaherty, I mean, I'm open to that. I think we want to make sure that we do this right because we don't want to lose, you know, affordable housing and things like that. It's just sometimes, like I said, I'm open to your suggestion here. We were looking to push it out till, I think, next March, so it would be a year. I don't want to lose people on the board that think that still, I don't want to lose people on our council that may have maybe not a great view of the BPDA and want to keep them under a microscope. So that's something that I'd like to keep into. You know,
Sure.
I totally agree with you. I want to allow this team here as much time as they need to make sure that we're going to be able to do this thing rightly. So yeah, we'll.
And Mr. Chair, I would suggest that you keep this docket, keep it in committee.
Yep.
And have them report every 6 months. Or you want to do it quarterly, but I think 6 months would be appropriate. So we have an open docket.
Yeah.
So we have a matter in front of us. If we keep this matter open and have it as a working document, then to your point, that's how we were able to keep the BPDA's feet to the fire on this issue. So
Okay.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chair. Thanks to my colleagues for their indulgence.
Does anybody want to speak to that?
I think Councilor Baker, you also put it well. There are, and we tried to acknowledge this in our opening statements. There are certainly those who are skeptical about urban renewal, given its truly checkered past. And I think we want to acknowledge that those constituents have concerns about the ongoing extensions. So I think what we're trying to do here is find an appropriate middle ground that provides that transparency and accountability, provides the data that the council needs to review in order to make informed decisions, but also be responsive to the legacy of urban renewal and ultimately our plan for sunsetting over the long haul.
Thank you. You're all done, Council Flynn?
Yes.
Flaherty?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Council Flynn?
Thank you, Council Baker, and appreciate Councilor Flaherty's comments about, giving the BPDA enough time to make sure that they do their work. But I also agree that, a few months is not enough time, that we need to make sure that as a council, as a body, that we give them the opportunity to let them do their work in a professional environment without being rushed. And that brings me to the LDAs in my district, but also other people's district, and I've said this before, but I can't have one resident impacted at all by any decision in a negative way by the BPDA as it relates to possibly being forced out of their house for apartment for any particular reason. The 50 years seems like a long period of time that people are in an apartment, but I've dealt with apartments and units in Chinatown that were up after 50 years, and had the opportunity to work with Sheila Dillon's team to address the situation. But 50 years does come up pretty fast for us, and we don't want to be the ones making a decision that impacts immigrants, communities of color, and throwing people out of their apartments. I'm not doing that. That's my #1 priority, is making sure residents that are currently living there, that they're protected, that their quality of life is addressed. But under no circumstances could I ever support something where one tenant is forced from their apartment for any reason. That's my #1 priority. The other priority I have is, as Councilor Flaherty mentioned, and I've said this publicly, if some of these are sunsetted as the plan would be over the next year, I don't want to see developers take advantage of this situation in their own way to financially profit from decisions that we're making here today at the expense of residents. So, whether it's a BPDA ethics or it's BPDA legal counsel, but I want to make sure that there is no, there's no developers being cute behind the scenes trying to take advantage of this situation, because they follow this issue very closely, and I'm not supporting anything if I know that this is going to benefit any developer down the road. What do you think?
And
That's my question.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Councilor. It's an exceptional question, and I think you're absolutely asking the right one, and with your focus with the 3 downtown districts, keeping the focus on the residents of Chinatown and preventing displacement and preserving affordability, I think is absolutely appropriate. And I think it just goes back to the distinction between the 5 that we're recommending for sunsetting versus the 9 where additional time is needed. And because I don't think we can say with authority today, to the earlier points, that situation is not going to happen. I mean, Chris just gave a great anecdote about it might be a small case, but an open space restriction in Charlestown that obviously has development interest, and if that LDA expires, then if that developer still owns that property, they'll want to pursue development. So what you're saying is absolutely spot on. But it was a lens we took to our analysis and why we're recommending the 5 that we would recommend to sunset in April, and why we're preserving the 9 for additional time.
Residents have asked me if this does take place, are we able to prohibit the use of Chapter 121A for private developers?
Sure, I think.
Would you like me to give a little bit more background on that question?
I would.
Okay. So listening to some residents in the South End concerned about the usage of 121A for private developers would allow developers to get tax breaks and bypass the regular ZBA variance approval process. So the context of this is that there is a project in the South End where developers could possibly use 121A to redevelop a building, and their plans brought up a lot of concerns from neighbors.
So when a request comes in for us to consider a project for 121A approval, we work closely with assessing, because the 121A is giving a tax break to the property if it's for affordable housing. And, there does, in order to use 121A, there is an extraordinary benefit that's being achieved from that project. A lot of affordable housing, saving an exceptional landmark like the Huntington Theater. So, but there's a careful consideration there. It's not used that often. I understand the concern, but it's looked at. The one benefit of 121A is that the zoning relief is granted through that process, so it is a BRA approval. It's a public hearing, so there is opportunity for the community to comment on it at the time it is approved. But then any changes come through the BRA for further zoning or whatever. And the tax break is already built into the project at that time. But it's a careful consideration. It's not something that's deployed, just because someone asked for it.
But Eileen, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is the BPDA's ability to utilize 121A tools to create tax breaks for public benefit, it's not tied directly to the urban renewal plans that are
No,
expiring?
it's a separate statute. It's a separate
Okay, thank you.
power of the agency.
And then just one quick comment. I think people here know the Councilor Block highlighted it. China World Trade Center, critical role in the community. Temporary library was there. The Chinatown Historical Society, the Urban College. I believe there's another arts group. There's a woman's hairstyling company there. So I want to make sure that as this process continues, that building, we're able to make sure that small businesses stay there, but there's a major component to community space, whether it's a historical society or various nonprofit groups that do a lot of exceptional work. You highlighted BCNC earlier on your slide presentation, but that building plays a critical role in the neighborhood, and I know we've talked about that before. Finally, I just want to read something briefly, the Park Plaza Urban Renewal Plan. Someone mentioned to me what impact this would have. Maybe the state transportation building is not necessarily in the zone per se, but if we sunset anything in this area, would this set a precedent that developers are able to build as high as the transportation building, potentially knocking down the transportation building if it was sold at one time, and building large buildings in that area?
The restrictions on height, and Chris, I need for you to jump in on this one, are tied to the LDA properties in the Park Plaza plan. So that it does not regulate height. Zoning regulates height on the properties that are not LDA properties. Does it provide an additional level of protection? Yes, it does, and that would go away. But then ultimately zoning is pretty attentive to height in that area.
Say the last part again. What goes away? What
the LDA properties, I believe, have height restrictions on them, and I know the constituents in the Park Plaza area are very concerned about shadows cast on the plaza. My understanding is that the LDAs do speak to height restrictions, but zoning also speaks to height restrictions. Zoning does while the ability to enforce those LDAs would go away after April 22nd, we can still enforce zoning.
Yeah, but they could get approval at the ZBA for larger buildings, but if the urban renewal is still in place, there'd be more protection for the neighborhood, right?
I think that's accurate.
So that's a quality of life for residents in the neighborhood. So something to think about. That's why, going back to my colleague, Councilor Flaherty, a lot of these decisions that we're making today, have permanent, are going to be with us permanently. So we need to think this through, and we want to make sure we give you guys enough time to make those decisions. I would like to see a longer period of time, so we're able to consider those types of questions. I'm sure there's dozens and dozens of those types of questions around the city, and I think residents would want to make sure that we do our due diligence as a city council body too, to make sure that we do our due diligence to represent them the best we can. But having said that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your hard work on this project. Thank you, Councilor Baker.
Thank you, Council Flynn. Council Fernandez Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My goodness. Seriously. How y'all doing at home? Oh my gosh. So, tell me, how long have you known that this was going to expire and that at some point you needed to do this work?
I think, Chris, I mean, this is Chris's full-time job, so Chris is probably very apt to answer that question, but I think probably the general answer is in 2016, the council extended, working with the mayor's office at that time, the urban renewal plan areas until April, right? So we knew that in 2016. In 2020, Chris put together, working with numerous people across our agency, the proposal to sunset first 5, then 4, and now back to 5, but sunset a select few districts in April, and then set out a timeline 2 years ago for the sunsetting of the rest, the majority sunsetting by 2026, and the last ones, the largest ones, sunsetting by 2030. That answers the question.
Yes, thank you. How much data have you collected since 2016, then 18, then 20, then predicting 26, now 2022? How come you don't have the data?
How much data do we provide in community meeting? Or?
You have to do a study that essentially have to look at all of properties that went under, these acronyms.
Yeah. The land disposition agreements. The LDAs.
Thank you. Land disposition agreements, y'all. Just in case, which means that essentially it's an agreement that I want to understand. It's an agreement that basically you create with a developer. At one point, BPDA acquired land. At some time way back in the 50s, some agreement went in place that this brilliant idea was going to go in, right? And then BPDA started acquiring chunks of land. BPDA then said, we have this plan and we're going to renew stuff and we're going to make it better for everybody. People were like, all the way in Charlestown, like black people used to live there. South Boston, East Boston, South End, Back Bay, and people started getting pushed out, and got poorer and poorer and went into the projects and therefore suffered. Now BPDA is here and saying, hey, new staff, new crew, new ideas. We're good people. This is not a pony show. We actually care. We want an extension because since 2016, we knew that we needed to do a study to figure out how we were going to protect people. Mm-hmm. Right, so 6 years later, like SpongeBob French guy does. We still don't know. You still don't have data, you don't know what, you don't have that information. Since 2016, you knew this, and now we're here, right? So I'm gonna move on. I don't wanna belabor that. I get it.
I can respond.
Please.
If you'd like. So first, I think it's important to acknowledge the displacement facts that you've outlined. That is true. That the legacy of urban renewal has caused displacement in some neighborhoods, and we have to acknowledge that. And we have to work as best we can to right that as we chart the future. I do want to acknowledge that a lot of data has been collected. That was really the major charge of the council in 2016, because I think the criticism that we were non-transparent, we did not have records. We had LDAs, but they were in file cabinets somewhere, and no one could access those if you were in the public or the landowner. So we've done a lot of work. So starting in 2016, given the directive from the council to become more transparent and accountable, we created Disposition, and we've worked to create an LDA database online. We created an action plan in 2020. That action plan spelled out exactly what we need to do in order to make sure as we sunset urban renewal, we do it with thoughtfully and don't cause harms to anyone or cause unintended consequences to lose tools that we might be able to deploy to help build communities in positive and progressive ways. So that action plan was submitted in 2020, and like I mentioned, it called for majority of urban renewal plan areas to be expired by 2026, and the biggest ones by 2030, because we knew at that time there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think what's important to acknowledge now is that we have a very new city council and a new mayor, and that and we're charting a new direction for our city, and it's important that we craft a plan for the future of urban renewal that's reflective of that new reality. And so that's why we're not here today saying, let's implement the action plan from 2020. Let's instead work together on an action plan that makes sense for this council and this administration.
Thank you. And so what about the restricted properties? This projected number of restricted properties that you're trying to protect. What about if one expires tomorrow? Like there's a property that I know of in my district that's going to expire any day now.
If the LDA can only be amended, because the LDAs are owned by private individuals, not always developers. In some cases, they're homeowners and affordable homeowners, or people who bought open space next to their house, but sometimes developers too. That LDA is a contract between the Bpda and that developer. To amend it will require the parties to enter into a negotiation and amend the contract. So if those are going to expire, there would have to be some event they'd have to come in and want to change in order for us to change it. What is, I think, our greatest concern is that we have those, and those expiration dates are further in the future. If we allow urban renewal in some of these plan areas where we haven't done enough of the research to tell you when those are going to expire and how they can be protected, that the action of allowing urban renewal to sunset next month would cause that contract to terminate. And
couldn't they just use a 121A to amend it and develop luxurious condos, however they want?
No, a 121A is generally a tax deal, and that's a new contract. They'd have to come in, and we'd have to run it through a process and decide whether or not we would want to do that. But I guess I'll also want to highlight that the majority of these land disposition agreements that we're concerned about are not opportunities for high-end luxury housing, but are in some cases restrictions on homeowners' properties that they actually may want to retain because it helps them, it keeps their property value lower, it keeps their tax payments a little bit lower because the open space restriction or the affordable housing restriction limits the value of the property. In some cases that might be a bad thing, but in some cases it actually might be a good thing for that homeowner because it helps them stay in their home.
I want to understand, thank you for that explanation. I want to understand, you acquire land, it's a business. You acquire land, you sell it. The land belonged to a people that now died and suffered. Now you have the land, you can't give it back. Could you give it back? You can't just give it back. But if you have the land, now you're gonna sell it to developers that don't even reflect the community that it's already affected. And those developers now are you're gonna commoditize this idea, and you're gonna those developers are going to make money, and how does that benefit BPDA? Like, how does BPDA make money? How, I want to understand. How, if you sell the land, you get the money, or how is BPDA financed, or how does BPDA benefit from developers, or how does all this work?
Yep. It's a very big question. I'll try to give you a quick vignette, and I'm happy to dig into it deeper. The BPDA is self-financed. The 70% of our revenue comes from real estate transactions, mostly ground leases that are paying money into the to the BPDA over time. We do get some grants for workforce training programs and other grant sources of the remaining 30%. The vast majority of our real estate revenues, in total honesty, come from the Marine Industrial Park in South Boston, where we operate job-creating, maritime industrial-focused property. Outside of the Marine Park, when we're developing land in Boston's communities, residential developments forbidden in the Marine Park as an industrial space. We are very deeply committed to public land for public good and putting the community at the center of decision-making processes on the future of their property. And the revenue deal for that, the future of that revenue, of the real estate, needs to make sense for the people of Boston. Right? We shouldn't give away the people of Boston's land for free to enrich private actors. So if we're doing something that is, and if the community supports a market rate development on a piece of property, then that market rate owner should pay a market rent. But oftentimes what we're doing and what the community's vision is for a particular piece of property is open space or affordable housing or community development, and then those are properties we're happy to give either greatly reduced or no monetary value.
To that point, and I'm going to make just 3 final remarks, I'm sorry, and I'm going to close. I'm so sorry. And I know that you, in your job, you are doing what you can with the resources that you have available to you, and I appreciate your time and your work to doing it to the best, or at least as equitable as possible, and I appreciate that. What I will continue to hopefully work with you on is to advocate for the community. 1, give back the land. 2, hopefully, if you don't give back the land, fine, that's not going to work. Can we negotiate? Can we talk about real solutions for equitable development, responsible development? And because what I have to say about that is, in District 7, you know why my position is the way I grew up in Roxbury, right? Like, I really know this area. And you know those meetings, how they go, poor Morgan. So it's really, like, it's a lot on the community. These people come and they cry and they're in pain, right? And they're not being heard and they feel dismissed every single time. They ask you for affordable units. None of that happens. None of these solutions work. Affordable rental units on 80%, 100% AMI, 70% AMI, is impoverishing the Black and brown community. BPDA solutions to selling to white developers to build in our community, even when they're Black, those affordable AMI rates don't work, so it's a policy issue. And now you have people that feel dismissed, they're in pain, that cry, that die, that suffer, and it's just a perpetual cycle of, like, no real solutions, right? And they come and they yell at you and they're yelling at Morgan, and the community engagement feels pretentious and performative. None of it works. You're not reaching real people that really need to learn about this stuff. So then you have like a handful of, naysayers, and then everything gets disregarded. Just a big mess, just a big headache, right? So what I have to say about that is we have a lot of work to do on engagement. Like, Washington Park got marked 100 trees to be cut down. I didn't even get word of it. Wow, what is going on, right? So then we have all of this commotion going on over there in South End. Developers are trying to buy parking lots out of, affordable housing units so that they can make luxury condos. Anything that they can, any type of urban renewal laws or, little nuances, as he calls it, to go in and displace people, that's what happens. And we don't have the answers, you don't have the answer, we don't have the answer. So I'm not pointing fingers, but I'm saying this is a real problem. Extending it to my colleague Flaherty mentioned, extending it, I feel, it's like, well, if you don't have the solutions and you knew that you needed the data, and now you're gonna go work on studying this thing, shouldn't we ask you for a progress report before we extend it past 8 months? Shouldn't we examine what work you've done? Shouldn't we put you on some sort of probationary something, right? You would agree. So I don't get the 2-year thing. I really would like to be able to critically look at a comprehensive plan and say, we are examining every 6 months, every 8 months, so that we can actually measure how we are actually getting to a solution. Because if we continue to just, oh, sure, like, urban renewal, great thing, and it gave us parks. Who cares? They're crumbs. And all of these things have killed and pushed people out. Who cares? So I, with all due respect and love and sincerity, you know you're my guy, you know I like you, but I have to say, we have to work together and we have to be honest with each other about how this is not it.
Councilor, I deeply appreciate your advocacy on behalf of your constituents and the people of Boston. I think it deeply resonates with us and what we want to achieve. I think you know the intent is there to lead forward a more equitable solutions and development. And I think that's the lens we want to take to this request for the extension. Are there problems we need to solve across the board in community engagement and developing land for public good? Yes, there are. And we're looking forward to working together to do so.
Thank you. I think we also have to ask the city, what is the alternative plan? What are our options when you can't protect these residents, right? Because it can't just be on BPDA, obviously. Again, your business, 70%, I mean, privately funded, like that's obviously you're in the business of making money. So I think the alternate solution has to come from us, the city, and figuring out what is the plan to protecting these residents so that we are actually sincere about what we say that we're about. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson. Before we move to Brian, so clarification, if we take no action, all of these go away in April?
Yes,
We'd
they go away 1 month.
All the LDAs, would lose all the, not necessarily open space, but all the LDAs would lose.
With the DHCD has required us to get a city council vote of approval to extend any urban renewal plan area. So if the city council takes no action, all urban renewal areas would sunset and end on April 22nd of this year.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Worrell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question, kind of piggybacking off of what Councilor Fernandez-Anderson asked was, can you talk to me about the community engagement process and the contact rate when you were engaging the community based on like the feedback that you provided here in the reports?
Son? Yeah, so we went out to every neighborhood, every urban renewal neighborhood. Some of them we did twice, particularly the ones that we had earmarked for potentially sunsetting. But we did all of them individually. We had, in Charlestown, we had 280 people. In the South End on Zoom, we had 256 people. In Washington Park, we had about 50 people in person. This is pre-pandemic. That were into it. They had written their own books about it. It was actually a pretty enjoyable team. Park Plaza, similar, smaller group, if I recall, but they were part of the CDC, CNC, and they were very interested in the history, and they were very kind and friendly. Some of the ones downtown, School Franklin, Government Center, minimal attendance, maybe some students from nearby universities who, Northeastern, Boston University, that were interested in it and on maybe doing it as a class. South Cove, we had a large turnout, along with Councilor Flynn's backing, certainly. So any sort of aid to get the word out there tends to make the biggest community meetings. So yeah, South End was busy. It was really busy. It was 260, but it was on Zoom, which is maybe not the same. We did do some smaller outbreaks to like the civic groups, just to introduce it. I don't know if you count that as a community meeting. But it was overall, it was a great experience. I wanted to go to every urban renewal area because that's the way my brain works. Like, they're all different, they're all unique. And when you start talking about one and then another one in the same meeting, it gets too confusing. So that's the way I did it. And I thought it was relatively successful.
And in terms of the Brunswick King area, I'm a district councilor, so what are the negative impacts for the residents in that area when these sunset? And
Yeah.
can you talk to me what can be done to help those residents that are going to be negatively impacted?
Brunswick King has negative impacts in the sense that that's something me and Eileen have been talking about. You have a number of open space parcels that I believe are taxed at a lower rate because there's a restriction on your parcel. Now, should that LDA go away, should that plan go away, should that restriction go away, would you be taxed at a higher rate? It's something that's ringing through my head and brain. And certainly, hopefully, we have the people in the building that can answer that for us. But that's a concern of mine, you know, to see elderly folks get taxed at a rate that they're not accustomed to is dangerous. I think in the Brunswick King area, that's probably the biggest risk.
And do we know how many residents that will be impacted?
I can foresee two sort of side yards, largeable side yards that you could build on that are used for parking. And the residents do not want to make that change. You know, they feel they've made enough changes in their life. And they are renters nearby.
But I think one thing I want to make sure we add, Chris, is when we went out and did the community engagement in Brunswick King, my understanding is that the majority of constituents who attended that meeting and provided feedback were supportive of of urban renewal expiring in the district, but had the concerns voiced were around the remaining publicly owned property. So the BPDA has 2 properties. The City of Boston Mayor's Office Housing has a few properties as well that seem to be very good opportunities for our continued effort to create affordable housing on infill vacant lots. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in that area for doing something with that vacant property. There's concern, I think, across the board that vacant property is not doing anything for adjacent community members. And there at the time, and this was one of the reasons why Brunswick King came out, is we thought, is it possible that we might need urban renewal tools in order to advance a development project in the public interest there? It seems, so that's why it came out originally with that, because of that concern. It seems relatively unlikely that we would need, or if we would need it, there wouldn't be another way to get it, because we're talking about residential infill development, and that's something that the City of Boston has done relatively successfully.
Yeah, and going out to the communities and walking the walk and walking the streets is probably the most intensive way to see how they live and what they need. And certainly in the public meeting, public good is important, particularly when it's something that directly affects the residents of the area. And they do see those 2 parcels that are vacant, and they do have dreams of it being potential home ownership units for friends, families, cousins.
Sorry, but in total, we have about 4 buildable lots inside the Brunswick King
Yeah.
area. Okay, and 2 of them attached to homeowners.
Yeah, and for us it would too, and then, you know, for D&D it's more, and they were asking me, you know, could you do something bigger? Could you combine, make it something really amazing. And,
But it's two. There are two BPDA-owned properties.
yeah,
Right.
for us, it's two.
It's okay.
But why not, right? So I think it's that outside-the-box thinking with the support of the community where you could use an urban renewal tool in a really successful way.
And so when it's sunset, it goes back to the city of Boston, or? what's-
No, we continue to
still-
own the property.
still-
Okay, all right. And then what is the impact that this has, it's sunset, and have on Lila Frederick, if any?
The school or
The
the
school.
The school.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk out of turn. I think the Lila Frederick, I think initially we controlled or took the playground area / parking area, not the actual physical school. So imagining.
Yeah, I've had some conversations with BPS on this recently, because I figured this might be a question that came up. The Frederick School is one of the middle schools that that BPS has advanced the thinking on that. It's not the model they're going to continue. I believe the current plan is for the school to be used as swing space for renovations at other schools, so we'll continue in educational use. And to Chris's point, we did transfer there are some LDAs on the open space, but those are now in BPS ownership and being used as a playground, so it doesn't seem like there's a lot of risk there. And I guess, I think this is in the eye of the beholder, but that it does not seem that there's a immediate obvious need for the use of urban renewal tools. That if the school became vacant property and it was surplus by this council and then wanted to be redeveloped in some scenario, would we need urban renewal tools to do it? That's a pretty large hypothetical there, and we don't see the immediate need versus the residents' feedback that their only concern were those two properties.
All right. And then last question, those two homeowners that would be affected when this sunsets, is there any communication that would go out prior to their tax bill that would inform them that you might see an increase in your taxes or the impacts this sunsetting will take?
I think the technical answer to that is no, because it depends on what the assessor's department assesses the property at and what the zoning implications are for open space. It may be impactful to Chris's point, but it may have no impact if the backyards are unbuildable.
I mean, Catherine's going to come talk to me about it anyway, so if we can get a definitive answer on how much it goes up, I don't mind delivering that message. Because we don't even know if it will or if maybe it won't.
The city process for how they assess property, when they do it, when they catch up with restrictions ending. It's just a matter of, it's definitely something that the property owner would want to be aware of, but it's not going to happen overnight. I don't think that the city's going to send someone out there and say, hey, that restriction's gone. This property, you now owe higher taxes on this property because it's worth more. I don't even know how they would assess that side yard piece in relation to the larger parcel. So there's a couple of factors that go into determining that, but I do think that it's important that people are aware that that is a potential outcome.
Right.
You might see me out there brooming and sweeping it.
Those one or two abutters.
Yeah,
So that
appreciate
it's
that.
clear to them what's actually going to happen, if there's something that the BPDA can do in conjunction with the assessor's office and your office to mitigate any of those negative impacts, we will absolutely do that, especially in the specific instance where it's one or two individual homeowners.
I appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Worrell. And along that line, that could also affect them positively if they wanted to build on the land, correct?
It could, yeah, it's definitely, you can build on it.
Okay. So the first round of questions, I wanted to be able, people have their time to get the questions out that they wanted to. Now we're going to just go around another brief brief round if people do have more questions, and if we can keep everything as tight as possible, I would appreciate that. I just have one question on how we move forward. So we had some suggestions on maybe a longer extension period. I don't know how people feel about that, but if the BPDA board votes first, who's going to come up with the language? So they vote on it and we'll vote on the exact same language, or can someone run me down on that?
We'll need to work closely with council and IGR to make sure we coordinate this appropriately. I don't think anyone on the panel today is the appropriate person to answer that
Okay, so
technical question.
we're involved in the language on what we're
Yes.
actually going to be voting on. So what we vote on will be the same as BPDA board.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to turn it over. I knew I had another question someplace, but I'm a little bit spread out here. So I'm going to turn it over to Council Block.
Great. Yeah, and I'll be very brief because I know we've got several panelists in our second panel who have been waiting for a long time. So I would just say the one note I wanted to make was vis-a-vis Councilor Worrell's question about his district. I mean, it does seem to me like the whole reason why we need to do this right, and I agree with Councilor Fernandez-Anderson that if the goal had been to sunset on the timeline that you're talking about now previously, then the city would have taken different actions than it did. But it seems like there are a number of things where there are opportunities to mitigate the harms. So for instance, like with these two property owners, right? Like, you know, there's probably a way for someone to offer a voluntary open space restriction that somebody else holds, which prevents that like tax thing from going up. But I think the issue is we can solve that on a bespoke level for two privately owned parcels in Brunswick King. We can't, in a matter of days, solve that for almost 300 parcels in Charlestown, right? And so I really want to stress that to me, the work that lies ahead is not just work of information gathering, it's work of like strategizing and problem solving, right? It's like, how would the city deal with XYZ issues with the other tools that we have? Or, you know, are there situations where there's a parcel that we don't have anything but urban renewal, and so we want to shrink the boundaries of the district to just that parcel, right? And say we're gonna, so I just want to stress that I think that seems soluble now, but there are a number of these where it feels like the whole problem is that we need to kind of work through them individually. And to that end, I mean, my gut on the extension conversation is that the short lease makes sense, but that, as I said at the start, that December 31st is a very inconvenient time for this body and our legislative calendar. And so that it would be better to push that to like March 31st, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that we, as Councilor Flaherty did, that we go to a full 2 year, because I think the idea of, hey, we gotta really be working on this is important. And then just the one question I wanted to ask, because it relates to our second panel. This is, I know Councilor Fernandez-Anderson knows Streets of Hope. It's a book that I love, but there's a quote from the newspaper when, so we'll talk a little bit more about this that I asked you in my questions, but folks may not know that the whole way that the Dudley Square Neighborhood Initiative, the sort of grandmother of the land trust movement in Boston and frankly nationally, got its land was through the BPDA's eminent domain powers and the use of, and I think it was the first time in the country that those powers were basically transferred to a nonprofit as an agent. And there's a quote from the newspaper when that happened that said, "There's nothing new about community residents unifying to influence the thrust of development in their neighborhoods. What is very new, however, is a community-based group that doesn't just have the ability to influence development, but the authority to control it as well." And I think this relates to something Councilor Louis-Jen said at the start. I do think that the future of, like, if there's a way to use some of these public land use tools well, I think it has to run through real community control. And, you know, one of the interesting points that's made by this book is that it was a huge political effort by the residents of Roxbury to get the urban renewal tools used in that way, in that moment for DSNI. It's had enormous positive impacts over decades, but it's never been replicated. And now we sort of have like a burgeoning land trust movement in the city. And I think I just want to ask you guys on record, I know it hasn't been a sort of continuing tradition of the agency, but in principle, there isn't anything, am I correct, today to prevent us from again using the urban renewal powers in conjunction with community land trust? Is that the case?
In principle, no. And I think it's worth acknowledging, and you just did, Councilor Bach, that the DSNI is a national model, right? People come from all over the country to look at the way that that land trust has succeeded over time. And if there are, as we chart the course for the future here, if there are ways we can look to that example and incorporate that into the future planning, we're very eager to have those conversations.
Great, thank you. That's it for me, Mr. Chair.
Heather, do you have something to say? Council Louis Jen?
Thank you. Hopefully 2 short questions. You said 30% of the revenue from the BPDA comes from grants, work. Can you expound on that?
So the majority of those, and happy to follow up offline with some detailed numbers, but the Office of Workforce Development is under the BPDA. They're eligible for community development block grants. So those dollars pass through D&D and then are transferred to the BPDA to operate those workforce development and training programs.
And is that basically all of the 30%?
I believe so. I think they're all grant programs, yes.
Okay. And then shout out to Jeep Jones for his work in the city and the ingenuity with making DSNI happen. I agree with my Councilor Bach. Like, I think that a short lease is good here. I think a good idea could be to automatically put this before the council annually until they're no longer necessary to have us vote and reapprove. I think 2 years would be too long. I think 8 months is too short. So I think, we do want to have our eyes on this, and but we also do want to be realistic. Hopefully, we can make good progress in that time. But yeah, so that's just my thoughts there.
You good?
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Fernandez-Anderson?
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm a little tapped out, but my question, I think just a little bit about how BPDA transfers land to Office of D&D.
Mayor's Office Housing.
Yeah. Mayor's Office of Housing, and then becomes available to potentially sell as low as $100. How can we make that more available or possible?
Yeah.
And then, go ahead, you can ask.
We enjoyed a close relationship with Mayor's Office Housing. As mentioned earlier, I worked there for 5 years. I know Sheila and her team well, and we're very eager to collaborate together. I think that the BPDA also very eager to dispose of property for $100 in support of affordable housing, if that's appropriate. I think maybe one important distinction between the BPDA's real estate portfolio and the Mayor's Office of Housing is that in general, our model is ground leases. We do some sales where we give up ownership, but across the board, in general, our model is ground leases, which retains public ownership of the property. The model of the Mayor's Office of Housing is sale of real estate, which then gives up public control of real estate. Now, there's nuances that we could talk about it more, but I think that would be the major distinction.
And there's possibility to do that with nonprofit or outside agencies as well?
Yeah, and we routinely do it together, and would like to do it more.
I'd like to thank you for our previous collaboration, our ongoing collaboration on the District 7 Art Corridor and activating spaces. Really enjoying that, and I thank you and your team for really putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you. I do agree with Councilor Bach on the date. So I think March 31st, is that what you said, Councilor Bach? Is good. And then I would also say, can we talk about, or maybe it's the next hearing or working session, can we talk about details in terms of what are we looking for? How are we checking in? What are our questions? Because again, I just want to measure it. I just want to really get results. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Worrell?
Yeah, as of now, no further questions.
Okay, thank you, Councilor. And I'm almost wondering if we bifurcate it and we just vote for the 5 that we want to sunset and then figure out what date we put on the other one. But again, we'll go into a working session or some sort of model of what our next move is.
To clarify, Councilor, we need your vote on the extension. It's the extensions require
Oh,
the
so
vote of
we
the
don't,
council.
so the 5, we
no,
don't,
you
we don't vote on that, we just
Right.
don't take any action, just expires.
By
Okay.
choosing not to vote to extend those, they will expire.
Perfect.
And I will just add again on behalf of myself and Councillor Flynn that I think we're looking for that to be the 4 because there's some significant issues with the Park Plaza one that have been raised to our attention, both the China Train building and then this concern that basically because it's the only state plan, it's a urban renewal plan that is both city and state, that right now it gives us more levers for a conversation if the state were to dispose of significant assets there, a thing which they are doing around the city. So I think we really want more conversation. So we are looking for us to move that into the March 31st bucket instead of having it in the
Okay.
expiration bucket.
Okay, and I just have one quick question here. On the example you pointed to 555 Columbia Road as an acquisition, you guys. How did the building across the street, the Citizens Bank, go? How did that happen?
So, the BPDA directly acquired through a direct negotiation with the Bank of America was the owner, the Bank of America building. The Mayor's Office of Housing has a program known as the Acquisition Opportunity Program, which works with nonprofits and in some cases for-profit owners to acquire real estate. They fund the acquisition of the
Mayor's Office
the
has
Mayor's Office,
D&D.
but Mayor's Office of Housing does not actually acquire. They fund the acquisition of a third party to acquire, in this case DSNI, to acquire that real
Is
estate.
that just a grant to DSNI?
It depends on the structure. In some cases, it's a loan.
Okay, thank you. I think no further questions. I think we're good, and we'll bring down our next panel. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Lydia Lowe is on the screen.
Okay.
I think Molly Goodman might have just had to go. She may, but where's the list? Do you know?
Minnie McMahon.
Yeah, isn't it?
Oh, that's Minnie McMahon.
No, it's Minnie's joining you and Lydia's up there on the screen. And then we had Molly, but I think we just lost her.
Where's Molly here?
Molly Goodman, she was here for almost all of it, yeah. She must have gone like 5 minutes ago.
So it's, we've got it, but it's not Jesse and not
Yeah,
Molly.
yeah.
So just,
Yeah. Good afternoon. I think what I'll do is we'll go to you guys first, and then we'll go to Zoom, up to Lydia up there. I see her up there on Zoom, so whoever wants to start first, you can just present.
Is this okay? Good afternoon. My name is Minnie McMahon. I'm here representing Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative and the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before the council today. And John Smith, who is our executive director, sends his apologies for not being able to be here today. So as you know and has been discussed a little bit already today, DSNI is a community planning and organization in Roxbury and North Dorchester. And in addition to our planning activities, we run a community land trust called Dudley Neighbors Incorporated, which owns and stewards over 30 acres of land for multiple uses in perpetuity. On those acres today, we have 226 affordable housing units, both rental and home ownership. We have open space, we have a playground, we have ground leases with urban farms, we have a couple, 2-3 community gardens, and currently 9 affordable commercial units that are being rented from us. So DSNI's 30 acres were acquired from the city and from private owners with the help of eminent domain powers granted in 1998 by the city of Boston and the BRA. And at that time, the financial value of the land in the Dudley neighborhood was minimal, And no doubt the differences in perception about the value of the land was instrumental in the people of Dudley gaining control of the land at that time. And so the Community Land Trust was formed to manage and steward those acres permanently. Just a brief word on community land trusts. CLTs are a model. We remove land from the speculative market and commit its use to community. CLTs stabilize communities both in times of hot and cold real estate markets. They build community, they ensure community governance through the board structure and other activities and measures. And I'd like to note that while DSNI is indeed a leader and has some cachet on the national stage, we work very closely and help support the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, which is an association of CLTs regionally, working together very strongly to deepen and broaden community control of land, housing, and our neighborhoods for the long haul. So yes, we do continue to be a model nationally because of our activities stewarding land and prioritizing community control. And I would like to highlight, in addition to the fact of the ownership and management of land, we do have an MOU with the City of Boston regarding disposition of public lands within a portion of our catchment area called the Dudley Triangle. So we conduct with the city land use processes for these partials to ensure that the uses that are decided upon are in line with our community priorities. And this type of community control of planning should be a model for each neighborhood in the city, because it is the local residents who best understand and can plan for their needs. So today, as we think about land use tools and better ways to develop our communities, just some suggestions we'd like to make. We advocate for continuing models of co-governance that do rely on working with you, the members of the council, with departments at the city, and of course with community-based organizations and local residents, and really need to uplift long-term stewardship strategies as well as preservation, which has come up quite a bit today. We ask that you today, and as we continue to work together in the future, consider the following suggestions: that the city set acreage and parcel unit, whatever the appropriate units are, goals to actually bring more land onto CLTs, to really put some numbers attached to ideas around support for CLTs. We want to see RFPs really focusing on community priorities from whatever department is issuing those RFPs. We want to see, it would be wonderful to see RFPs requiring or, more heavily weighing proposals that work with CLTs. And we would also like to see RFPs that really prioritize equity partnerships and encourage and reward diverse applicants and groups of applicants who couldn't develop on their own. And then we also would really like to look into, with you, the establishment of a municipal land bank to compile vacant properties, problem, surplus properties, and part of that land bank having, a preference for disposition to CLTs, of course, for appropriate properties. And I will just add a couple more points, and then I'll close. A lot of these sort of tools and uses can be on CLTs or not, and the benefit of the CLT really is huge: community governance, long-term stewardship. We would like to see 25 more urban farm sites by 2025. Commercial zoning overlays that promote innovation, incubation, and flexibility for new local and small business. Homeownership and rental units at rates that are truly affordable according to neighborhood conditions, not area median income. And a preference for other shared equity models like owner co-ops or rental co-ops in RFPs, or somehow incentivized or supported through other city programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Minnie. Josh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilor Bach, for the invitation, and you, Mr. Chair, and Councilor Louijean for co-sponsoring this, Councilor. It's nice to be here. It's my first time sitting, I think, in this row. I may have sat in every other seat in this room before. But to be quick, I know
What's your name?
Josh Stakem,
Hi, Josh.
Executive Director of Housing Forward Massachusetts. I want to be quick. I know we've been here a while today, and I'm here obviously to talk about innovative ways to create more housing in the city of Boston, and we have a lot of tools to do that, and that's what Housing Forward's mission is. It's to, through reforms, through smart growth strategies, to make it easier for people to produce housing at all levels of the market. And the city of Boston, and as we just heard extensively, the BPDA has a lot of tools to do that, as does the city itself, as does the city council. And right now, there is an urgency, and there has been for as long as I can remember, to create more affordable housing at all levels, create affordable home ownership opportunities, something that I think is often not at the forefront of the conversation. We need to be talking about rental and home ownership opportunities, and community land trusts obviously are a proven method to do that. And we would certainly advocate for when the city is disposing of property, or in some cases building on top of existing city infrastructure. I know you, Mr. Chair, have often talked about building above libraries or schools for affordable housing and senior housing over the years. I think it's incredibly important, and something that in most cases won't cost any money for the city of Boston. It could be a partnership with nonprofit or for-profit developers looking at tax incentives, but there needs to be a sense of urgency, I feel, on this front. And I got a lot of that from the counselors in the earlier part of this hearing, that there's been a lot of talk about these issues, and we need to do something about it. With direction from this body, from the mayor's office, there's a lot that can be done. In Councilor Bach's district, I've often talked about, and I'll let her speak to it if she wants to, but things like the West End Library, which is a prime example of really prime location real estate that the city owns, that is the library is a thriving and important part of the community, but should be looked at to see what can go next to it or on top of it. And again, in partnerships that are not going to cost the city significant dollars, but will create more housing, more affordable housing, and again, depending on the specific structure, more future revenue for the city and other city services. Something that in our work, and Housing Forward's only existed for about 18 months, maybe 20 months at this point, is when talking to developers, either nonprofit, for-profit, community development corporations, whomever it is, looking for predictability in the city process so that they can plan out what is feasible, how much affordability, how many units can be created, and that's something that's very much in the power in this building to do. I think with the direction, with that sense of urgency to do something, at a minimum, we're always looking at several years out. Building, permitting, planning, having community input on something, but we have the resources. We have a lot of city-owned land, and that goes from large parcels to, smaller parcels in the neighborhoods that can hold single-family or 2 or 3 family homes. Making changes, making zoning and planning policy that makes it easier for folks to build on those parcels, to attach long-term affordability to them, to create home ownership opportunities is critical. So I applaud you for holding this hearing. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here and to join you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. I have many ideas on this front. I know you all do as well, but there is something here. There is an ability in City Hall, in Boston City Hall, and in city and town halls across the Commonwealth to take important steps. More funding, absolutely, it is important on this front, but there's a lot we can do in a revenue-neutral way that's going to create significant more affordability in housing across the city of Boston. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Josh. Lydia Lowe?
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'm Lydia Lowe. I'm Executive Director of the Chinatown Community Land Trust. And I wanted to say that, many people are not aware, but actually the first use of urban renewal in Boston was not the West End. It was Chinatown and the New York streets, the adjacent New York streets area, which was documented in Mel King's novel Chain of Change. And, you know, urban renewal and the BRA have really been a double-edged sword for Chinatown. On the one hand, we had the so-called slum clearance. We had land turned over to the highways for construction. We had institutional expansion and then luxury development. But on the other hand, hundreds and hundreds of affordable housing units also are related to the use of urban renewal powers and have been, in fact, some of the developments that have anchored Chinatown over the decades. There's also been the ability to assemble larger parcels to prevent expiration of affordability when subsidies expire, and to enforce long-term agreements through land disposition, through LDAs. So over like 30 years of fighting the BRA around community control of development, I've started to learn more about urban renewal tools and started to realize that, you know, it's not so much the tools that are the problem. The problem is power and accountability and who is doing that, who is making those decisions. So I think, you know, now as the director of a community land trust, our goal as a community land trust is community governance. And I think that if community governance can be tied and some of these tools can be used to actually increase the possibility of community governance, that's where we can make a real transformative impact on the city. And we were formed, inspired by the experience of the Dudley Street neighborhood, where that neighborhood has stabilized so much as the rest of Boston has been undergoing a displacement crisis. So I want to speak to just a few examples of, you know, how we could maybe use these tools, or how we could think a little bit more proactively to really stabilize our neighborhoods, because it's almost been like a given that, you know, this is great. You know, the DSNI was given the power of urban renewal, you know, in the 90s. You know, they did this great thing, and it's never going to happen again. But why couldn't it happen again? So, for example, and I just wanted to say I have seen changes in how the BPDA operates over the last 5 years. But again, it's a double-edged sword, because I think when the BPDA is involved in public parcels, then there's much more attention to community planning. There's much more attention to community priorities and really trying to figure out how to use the public land for the public good. But when the BPDA is in charge of development review processes on private land, then it seems like there's a lot of unwanted private development that's still happening. But in terms of the examples, so for example, in Chinatown, there's parcel R1, which is a public parcel that's up for development that's really being looked at for the purpose of affordable housing and a permanent library. But there's also, why couldn't the BPDA work with the community to acquire a sliver of privately owned land in order to ensure that that development either could be extended to increase the amount of affordable housing, or maybe to have a really excellent community building public open space next to the library. There are other publicly owned parcels or properties, such as parcel 12. I think that there were some sliver parcels just across the bridge in the South End, which may have already been disposed of, but sliver parcels in the community's hands can actually help us to have more community control and influence over private development. There's the China Trade Center, which people have mentioned in relationship to the Park Plaza urban renewal plan. That China Trade Center, a few decades ago, it was meant to be a center for community economic development with small Chinatown businesses as well as community spaces. We would like to see that building be under community control again and really try to make that vision a reality. We have, people think that Chinatown is all either, is mostly luxury development now or the old properties. But you may be surprised to know there are buildings in Chinatown that have been boarded up for 20 years. Why cannot the BPDA, use those powers to move this property that's been boarded up all this time, these problem properties, into productive use for the community, for the priorities that the community wants. And, particularly when we think about buildings like the Dynasty Restaurant, which has been boarded up since I think the 90s or earlier, the China Trade Center, this is a particular moment for, with the experience of the pandemic for these very historic and important small business districts, such as Chinatown, to really make sure that they survive. And using some of these tools could enable us to protect and ensure that these businesses are sustained. There's an opportunity to move as there is housing currently affordable. A lot of affordable housing in Chinatown is on old urban renewal property. Is there an opportunity to use, as we move out of urban renewal, into the sunsetting period, to use those powers to move these properties into tenant or community ownership so that there can be affordability, not just for 50 years, but in perpetuity. These are all important questions that are very real for Chinatown, that we can connect to specific properties, but which I think are examples of what can be done in other neighborhoods across the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions? I'm sure you do. Councilor Bach, we will start with you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Baker, and thank you so much to all three panelists, to Lydia, Minnie, and Josh, for sitting through a long hearing. This is the hazard of us combining the two dockets. And I also want to thank, unfortunately, Molly Goodman from Abundant Homes had to go, but she's a huge housing advocate in the city, and we regret that the panel took so long, the first panel. So I want to thank Molly, and then also wanted to express thanks to Boston Harbor Now, which spoke to me extensively in relation to this docket, and ultimately weren't able to be here today, but they also sort of raised what wasn't addressed on the panel, which is the kind of like climate mitigation type impacts where you may need creative land assembly approaches and really thinking about what's the benefit of the whole community. There's a few places where the city of Boston has land that it knows is a piece of that puzzle. So I know, down in Councilor Baker's district, obviously talking about Moakley Park as a berm and sort of imagining it as a protection for the surrounding public housing communities and neighborhood. But it's come up increasingly that especially in the places where our waterfront is dispersed among a large number of private owners, that some of those like larger community interests are going to need real stewardship and attention, and may involve some of these tools. So I wanted to thank them for raising that set of points to me, and apologize to Molly that we weren't able to have her on the panel. I guess just quickly, because I know everyone's been here a long time, if you could give a little bit of an example, Minnie, of like what we mean when we talk about like community governance of land, and sort of maybe just an instance of how in DSNI that has actually looked. Because I mean, I totally agree with what Lydia just said. Like, I love the idea that where we come out on the Park Plaza vis-a-vis the China Trade Building is that we transfer it to some kind of community control, since that's really the interest that we, the city, have seen for that building anyways. But as we all know, there's a difference between the city doing something on behalf of the community versus the community kind of having that. But I think it'd be great to hear a bit about that. And then Josh, I mean, just think if there's any, I don't want to put you on the spot, but any example you can think of kind of, the West End Library is a great one. I would love to see, as folks know, significant housing density on top of the redeveloped library. Just, places that you've seen like significant housing development done in partnership with a city, in partnership with public land, or like any, just any examples that we could copy or think about. If you got any, that'd be great. But Minnie, I don't know. And Lydia as well, if there's anything on on community governance and sort of what you dream of when you say that, just because I think for those of us who, for you all in the community land trust movement, and for those of us who have the pleasure of talking to you, we talk about that a lot, but I'm not sure if everyone watching the hearing will really know what that means.
Sure, yeah.
Do it again.
Th-
It's good.
Thank you. Yeah, so two things come to mind. One is we have a Sustainable Development Committee, which is a committee, it's a board of director chaired committee of residents who review development proposals in the community. So this is a committee that private development comes through for comment, and then when there's parcels that are owned by Mayor's Office of Housing that are, an RFP is being crafted for those parcels, the Mayor's Office of Housing presents to this committee and together actually crafts the language of the RFP. So, you know, a number of processes are protracted of that happens, and because of COVID. So there's one parcel on Dudley Street, currently owned by the Mayor's Office of Housing. Years ago, we did a community process around, okay, what do people want to see here? People said, you know, we want mixed development, we want commercial on the first floor, we want affordable housing above it. A preference for we want multiple rooms because we're interested in housing families in this space. Input into the size of the rooms. We want to make sure bedrooms are big enough to have a place for my kid to sleep and a desk to do homework. So really getting into actually some of the design and really thinking seriously about the use of the development that would happen, and being in an iterative process with DND around that before the RFP gets released. And then, you know, once the proposals actually come in, community members who are present in that space and have like the voting powers and to make recommendations to the city, to the Mayor's Office of Housing on who to actually select for that development. So that's one example. Another is we own, this was mentioned earlier, 568, 572 Columbia Road, which is the former Citizens Bank building. We, Dudley Neighbors Incorporated, owns from, we got this AOP loan to acquire that building. We went through an extensive community process to go through, what do people want to see in this building, basically? There's a 20,000 square foot building. It needs to be redeveloped. We own it. We're a community land trust. What can we do with this? And this actual site is part of a larger redevelopment of Upham's Corner that involves land owned by the BPDA and land owned by, I don't know if it's Public Facilities or DND. So the outcome of that remains to be seen. It hasn't, we're still in pre-development with that particular project. But those are examples of like the Sustainable Development Committee having this review power, recommendation power, and also really like design process power with both the city and the developer when they really push back against the developer if they want to see changes with the proposals. And then with the land and the assets that we already own, like this Citizens Bank building, okay, what do we want to see built here, and how do we, we ourselves, we wrote the RFP and released that as part of this larger redevelopment of Upham's Corner.
Thank you for the question, Councilor. So it was a question, as I understand it, of examples of, was it public-private partnerships or using public land for housing? Yeah. Sure. I think one that always comes to mind, is in Chicago. They've done that usually with schools, or not usually, but on more than one occasion with schools. It's been a way to get private financing to build a primary school, a K-8 school with usually housing above it. I think that's something that would be great in the city of Boston. And I think any sort of public infrastructure on any sort of public land, every neighborhood is different, obviously, and not every neighborhood makes sense to build significant height above public buildings. Obviously, we have to be conscious of that. But I can't think of anywhere where it wouldn't make sense, aesthetically, neighborhood-wise, to add a few floors of housing above a library, above a publicly owned land. And obviously, the city itself is not going to be the builder, but working in conjunction with so many of the nonprofit or for-profit developers who are in the space and putting out RFPs, which happen all the time, of course. And I was just reading in the paper today about a large one, parcel 3. That's an enormous one, but it shouldn't all be that complex. There are hundreds of parcels in the city, ranging from ones that are appropriate for 1 or 2 family homes to ones where you could build hundreds of units of housing. And thinking about how to do that and saying, let's start with the 10. Let's start with the top 10 and say, we want RFPs for these. Let's get them out there. Let's turn them around in 6 months, figure out who's going to do it, and then obviously have that community planning process. Get the input from the neighborhood, from local civic associations, from elected officials on what should go there. But a lot of this also can, and in my view, and my organization's view, done through zoning. And saying, we need to do some significant rezoning of the city and make a lot of this as of right. I hear, and it's anecdotal, so take it for what you will, but that a lot of the smaller parcels that D&D, or I'm sorry, the Mayor's Office of Housing, that's the new formal term. It's going to take me a while to get used to that. Is putting out there is very challenging for people to build and bid on, even for those $100 fees, because there's a lack of predictability on what can be built there. Even with the affordability, I'm not talking about the affordability covenants being a challenge. It's that, for 1 family or 2 or 3 family house, then potentially go through a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years of reviews. So it's something that I think this body has a real ability to encourage and direct, making it more as of right. Not just getting the land or the property in the hands of folks who are going to build affordable housing is not the end of the line. It's not the end of the duty of the city. It's making it a little more predictable for folks who are doing that and setting a threshold for affordability. Is it 30%? Is it 20%? Is it 40? Is it 50 or more? I mean, on city-owned property, but making that fast-tracked as well, I think, is critical.
I just want to respond to that just quickly, and then we'll go to Lydia. So the best model that I saw that we did that was the NHI model, where they took D&D took city lots, they packaged them together, and then they went to the developers and said, this is what we want built. So it cut out that process. I don't really want to go to a model that is, well, I'd be hesitant to go to a model that would be as of right. I mean, I understand, and I've been through hundreds of planning processes, and some of them 2 years, some of them 8 years, but I think it's in that model, and we need to include the private money, private development. Fields Corner Library, I pushed for units above that for years. We finally brought it out to the community. They blocked it, and Fields Corner is one of the areas that really needs affordable housing. So, there's some tension there in the middle where we want to build housing, but people aren't letting us do it. So, thank you. Lydia, do you have anything to say on this? Examples of?
This was on community, if you had any community governance examples.
About community governance, I mean, I think Minnie answered that pretty well. What's interesting is typically the community governance, community land trusts through owning the land involve the community in making decisions about the land and how to protect it. In our case, since we don't own that much land in Chinatown, it's actually been different, but we have still started to play an important role in community governance. One of the examples is actually parcel R1, which is the public parcel that's now going through a process through BPDA, but we began that community governance and community visioning process before the parcel was put out to bid by kind of, organizing the community to reclaim a public parcel that was in use by the institutions, mainly used as hospital parking. and engaged in a lot of people in talking about what it is that we would want to see on that land instead. And then eventually got a conversation between the institutions, BPDA and the city, in which the institutions agreed to give up their development rights to the parcel. It went into a public process, and the review process really drew on that visioning that the community did. And now, through the BPDA's new project review committee process, that has kind of replaced our community governance role, or we've been supporting the project review committee to play that community governance role through this point. Another example is there's a park, that's right next to the steam plant, the Veolia steam plant, Reggie Wong Park. We want to be sure that as DOT sells the land out there, that the park remains and that it can actually be improved. So again, we don't own the park, we don't own the land, but we have already started to work with the community, with residents of Chinatown, the Leather District, the Chinese 9-man volleyball players that really use the park the most, to develop plans for improvement of the park, to share the stewardship in terms of who gets to play when. They have kind of an informal community schedule. The volleyball players share it with the skateboarders, share it with the neighbors that want to let their kids ride their tricycles around during the day, et cetera.
Great, thank you all so much, Mr. Chair. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. Councilor Louis-Jean?
Thank you. Want to thank Minnie, Josh, and Lydia for giving us so much of your time. I just have one question for Minnie. Something you said really sparked my interest in understanding how we can be more creative here as a city. You said that there's an MOU with the city regarding the Dudley Triangle, regarding the disposition of land. Before any action is taken with the disposition of land, the DSNI is consulted and brought into that process. I'm curious to learn more about whether that's is that for public land, or is it also for private land? And if it doesn't include private land, because I'd be really curious if it includes, like, if you are able to have some say over, like, privately owned land and what happens in that area, because that would be dope. But if not, do you have ideas on how we can actually also apply that to private land?
Yeah, thank you
You
for
mean
the
privately held land?
Privately held land.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, that's what I've been thinking about. I would like to learn more about BPDA's powers and other powers to think through that. So my understanding is at the time of the eminent domain agreement, the city said, the power of eminent domain was granted, and the city made a pledge to dispose of publicly held land to DSNI, to DNI at that time. And either at that time or subsequently, this agreement was made that, well, I'm thinking now that, so we currently, there are three MOH-owned parcels, city-owned parcels in the Dudley Triangle, which is where the eminent domain agreement was, that remain. So because of that original agreement, we know that we have a right to take over and develop that land. So we are, we speak closely with MOH as RFPs are getting developed. We help run the community processes. Once one of those parcels we actually do own, but it's still in pre-development. Two of the parcels the city owns, but we expect to take over. Once those are in use and developed, that's it for public land as far as we understand. That would be up for disposition anytime soon. So we don't have, so any private development that's happening in the triangle, they don't have to come through us. The city, we have a very good relationship with Mayor's Office of Housing, so if officers there are in communication with developers who are interested in developing, they'll say, oh, you really need to go talk to DSNI, and they'll send people to us to go through our Sustainable Development Committee process to get a recommendation, because if someone's, if they want to build something new or they're applying for a variance with ZBA or whatever, they want to have a letter from DSNI that says, look, the community supports us. But I don't think it's required that private projects come through us. And I don't know, I like that question, like, well, how can we encourage that? One thing I've noticed about working with the BPDA is, you know, we don't have the same sort of like partnership, close working relationship with them that we have with MOH. So we don't necessarily hear about projects that are happening in our catchment area. We sometimes have to kind of chase them and say, hey, like, can you let us know about this meeting? Or wait a minute, we need to extend the public comment period. We're just finding out about it. So we've definitely identified the need to like try to improve that relationship or those lines of communication.
Did you guys?
In terms of like tools and rights around private development, I would love to talk more with you, with the council about that and understand options better.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, like with DSNI, I have some of them in my district. If someone's looking to come and develop in my district, I would send them to DSNI if they're within there. And if they don't come to me, they're unable to go to DSNI. They don't get my support, or they don't get DSNI support, which is why when we talk a lot about, when we're talking about rezoning the city, rezoning the city is gonna become about what Josh had said, where you're now into parcels that are, oh, this is as of right, you know, there was a 2-family there, it's 9 units, so basically that cuts us out of it. When we have that rezone the city talk, you know, like, so in Roxbury, they're not gonna go talk to Tanya Anderson Fernandez, are not gonna come to me in my district. So I get concerned when we talk about just blanket rezoning the city, you know, because the zoning's in place, so they come in front of me and you and DSNI and those sorts of things. And there's quirks and all of it, but back to you, Josh, I think, you know what, no, I'm going on, I wanna go to Tanya.
Can I just,
Oh, I'm sorry.
no, because you just mentioned a
I'm
good
a little
point.
tired.
No, I'm tired too, okay? No, but the point that I wanted to mention and the things that I like to think about in my head are like, what does it look like to use like the right of first refusal and to think about what rights we give groups and what rights the city can have, whether it's a privately held parcel, right? Like how do we think creatively about who has the, you know, do we take precedent over a private owner who's interested? Can we think creatively about that? And I take your point. But those are sort of the things that I have going, like where can we exert our power as a city or in partnership with community groups to allow them, even if it's paying fair market value, right? To have and to be stewards of, you know, privately held land, to put that into a community land trust. I think Lydia actually also alluded to this too, right? Like the BPDA's ability, like why isn't the BPDA working with the Chinatown Community Land Trust to help them acquire a sliver of private land so that whatever is developed out of P1 could be larger. And so those are the things that I am very curious about, like how can we exercise power there? Not to be a completely, you know, also, you know, we could do it on a fair market value. It doesn't have to be completely, you know, communitarian, but
Completely socialist.
yeah, but yeah, I think that those are the things I like to think about. So just curious if you've thought about that.
And that actually is what the BPDA, what the city did back in the 90s, you know, when the power was given to DSNI. DSNI didn't just get public land, they got the right to take private land by eminent domain.
Yeah.
The private land that was abandoned and was not being taken care of by the owners.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I add just a couple thoughts? You know, one thing we're advocating for as a network with this wider coalition is the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is a statewide enabling legislation that, you know, that would help tenants become owners. It would also just help tenants stay in place if they then pass their right to us to purchase the building. Of course, we need revenue, you know, we need to be able to purchase the building. That's just it would give the right, but not the money. But that's something we're advocating for. And if that does, you know, if that were to pass and the city enabled it, yeah, what channel to like really facilitate those transfers? Like that could be something the city council could look at, and as well as funding. And then also, in our ecosystem, of course, there are a lot of this, like what you might call like the frontline groups, like City Life Vida Urbana, and working to prevent evictions and no-fault evictions, and we've groups in our network, including Chinatown CLT, including Boston Neighborhood CLT, have worked very close with Sheila Dillon and the AOP program to really try to save some at-risk properties. But of course, there's so many more, right? And right now we're kind of just like statistically a drop in the bucket in terms of need. But yeah, I think mapping at-risk properties and really starting to think about how much money would it take to secure like a significant amount of properties in the next 5 years in Boston, and where could that come from is a project we're looking at.
Can I
Josh?
just quickly add? I know, Councilor, you've got questions. I think, Councilor Louisiana, what you're saying, the BPDA certainly already has that authority, in my opinion. I believe the city also has an inherent eminent domain authority paying fair market value. And what that question is can often be prolonged and litigated. But what I would just add on top of that is that as we're talking about city-owned parcels already, like there's a lot that's already there that's like at our fingertips that we don't have, that the city would not have to litigate and pay for. And I think I think your comments about figuring out and mapping some of these other opportunities are a good idea from a planning perspective, and saying if something sparks up and we could do something incredible with it and it's worth both the actual dollars financially, but also what's, I'm not an eminent domain attorney, but what I understand is often a protracted and expensive legal process.
Hence, I didn't use that word. I'm trying to think about,
You already said it. We have it in our head. We can't.
No, I didn't say.
No,
I did not say. I'm a lawyer. I did not say eminent domain.
Oh, you
I did
just
not
said
say. I can't with you.
Well, I didn't mean to start all that, but I would just say I think there's so much exciting opportunity with land that we already have on the city rolls, for lack of a better word.
Point taken.
Yeah, and then that begs, what I had talked about earlier, that NHI model. I mean, we have 100 lots that we could use that NHI model, and not just as single families, two families, but put 40 units on places and turn it over for home ownership. I mean, we talk about affordability, but unless you're getting in there and you own that unit, forget about it. There's still not total stability there. So, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson.
Okay. So Mr. Chair, I'm interested in this NHI model. I don't know much about it, so would love to talk to you offline about that. Hi, Minnie, nice meeting you. I've been talking with Mr. Smith and really excited about the work that you guys are doing there and collaborating with you. I'm interested in understanding, when you are creating affordable home ownerships, are these all restricted deeds?
Well, so speaking of the NHI, the Neighborhood Homes Initiative, so historically, yes, all of our units are deed restricted. The highest, in the most recent developments, we have had, I think we have 2 units total at 100% affordable at 100% AMI. Most are at 80, and then some are at 60% AMI, and they're all deed restricted, 99-year. The built-in equity formula, resale formula. We do have, through the NHI program, in the pipeline, 16 units of home ownership. 12 of them will be affordable and rolled onto the CLT. 4 of them will just be sold off at market rate. And that is in order to make the deal possible. So I think this is the first time that we're doing that.
But the market rate is also limited also. It's like you can't, it says market rate, but it's not really market rate.
Right, and the city's been very clear about not wanting to be the market leader on those, on those units, that's right.
Have you thought about a way to making the restriction limited so that people can actually liquidate assets and build generational wealth?
So not, one thing we do have been looking at and sort of paying attention to this, what seems to be a wider conversation around, how do we build generational wealth? How do we close the racial wealth gap? Home ownership has been a huge tool and also destructive force as well when it comes to equity and economic parity. Part of the ethos, I would say, of the CLT movement, of our CLT, is upholding community wealth, upholding community stabilization, and also wanting to say that while equity is limited, it is a shared equity model. So folks are, people are accruing equity over time, but it is not at this, it's not at market rate. So we are certainly part of that conversation around how do we balance the goals of individual, family generational wealth building and neighborhood stability and community wealth building. But I would love to speak with you more about that and hear more about what's behind that question and your own thoughts too.
I guess one more for you is in terms of the RFPs that you mentioned, creating a process prior to it being actually published or announced, that, creating that process and making it equitable so that there's opportunity of grants or affordability or accessibility for community members. Really interested in that and would love to hear more about that. Is there a plan in place or is this just an idea for now?
For the crafting of the RFPs that I mentioned, is that what you mean?
Yes.
So for the DNI, the building in Upham's Corner that we own, which was formerly the Citizens Bank building, that was part of the sort of like a multi-lot. It is part of this multi-lot, multi-owner redevelopment process in Upham's around the Arts and Innovation District. So our lot has been, the RFP for our lot was crafted in conjunction with and parallel to the RFPs for the two city-owned lots. And that was like starting in 2017 through 2020, roughly, community process that was wider than DSNI and centered around Upham's. So we could certainly go into share a bunch of info about that and also where we are now with that. The crafting of RFPs for the site, these two particular sites on Dudley Street. Those, I think, the RFPs, the stipulations have to be, obviously it has to be within whatever the zoning is, and the city might have an idea about what they want to see there. So they're I don't know how wide open those, when you're really starting at the beginning, how wide open those processes are. But
thank you. There are a lot of lots that are not necessarily buildable because of size, but opportunities to create those urban farms or small food access spaces, incubators, smaller incubators, maybe food trucks, parking spaces, mobile boutiques. There are so many ideas, and there are so many entrepreneurs and already existing small businesses that are getting pushed out of brick and mortar. And I'm wondering if the RFPs process can include community in discussing how that maybe DSNI would then support community in activating those spaces. So beyond what you're doing now, but accessing smaller lots in District 7, I can speak for District 7, and how we can partner in doing that, right? So that's where I was taking that in terms of RFPs and looking at the process and making it accessible means that if BPDA has money or if the city we can figure out a way, then putting in money so that there are grants that folks can access in order to activate those spaces. Josh, if I mean, I understand your zoning thing about, building up, and I actually agree, I think we need to build up. My only concern with building up is that, so the city and their, and the state's master plan and the city's plans in terms of moving to transit transportation does not address the population, the very marginalized population that is not prepared to moving toward a transit culture. And so you have, single parents with sickly children, more disparities, more issues that have to access their car at the drop of a dime. So my concern then is, while we build up, that we address the families that continue to need cars or are in transition to just, riding a bike or jumping on the T. And I think that the city and the state both have a bad habit of speaking for the marginalized community and telling us what we need and what's good for us without any concern. And so I would say that I would support building up, and I know that our zoning policies are outdated, but I also agree with my colleague that we have to be careful in what the limitations are so that we can continue to have a say in terms of approving development.
Yeah, so I can certainly address that, and I want to after the chair's comments on that. I think when you're rezoning, it's a long-term, involved community process. It's what it takes out of the equation, though, is the one-off battles. It's the one-offs where someone takes one of those neighborhood homes, the NHI, a lot of acronyms, takes some of the city-owned parcels that are being put out for $100, purchases one of them, and then is going with the neighborhood association and the ZBA to build a 2 or 3 family house every time. Now, in my view, what could work is having a thoughtful, maybe it's a 2-year, maybe it's a 3-year process, maybe it's probably hundreds of community meetings that are going to say, this is what makes sense height-wise, use-wise, parking-wise for each neighborhood, but to making it not ad hoc each time, I think is the overwhelming challenge on the zoning front, in my view. And also moving on, if it's all right, if I could talk a little bit about home ownership as well, if that's acceptable.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
Okay, great. So
We're the only ones left in the building, let's go.
I know. All right, I'll try and be quick, and I know you all probably have about 15
The boss said, okay.
other meetings today. Quickly about some of the things that sparked in my mind when you were talking about home ownership and building wealth, and because this is about using city resources in particular, something that I think is worth examining is the city on a limited level, and this would require talking with the CFO and Corporation Counsel, of course, as acting as sort of a guarantor for people who are looking for mortgage loans, almost a cosigner.
Say that again, you want the city?
Acting as a guarantor or almost a cosigner for folks on loans, and this is something that needs to be obviously significantly fleshed out, both from a dollars and cents perspective and from a legal perspective. But the city of Boston has significant borrowing capacity, has a stellar credit rating, and I'm not saying we max out the credit card, so to speak, but thinking about some sort of pilot program at least that could do that, along similar lines, working with folks on supplementing PMI or private mortgage insurance.
Oh,
for
like the
folks.
one I filed, Josh?
The PMI one?
You're going to help me on that?
I
Is that what you're saying?
I absolutely am. And helping people with that is critical, because that is usually several $100s a month on folks, first-time home buyers, and we need to be looking at city resources for that too. It's not just all about building new things, getting public land. We can be creative. This is a smart city. There's a lot of smart people in this building with a lot of resources, and we can tackle issues of home ownership, increase housing capacity at the same time.
I'll stop.
You all done?
Rudy looks sleepy. Councilor
No,
Lucian.
I'm revived I'm actually interested in the guarantor program. Are you talking about just on public land, or are you talking about in all aspects?
No, maybe I'm taking a little too broad of a view on public resources in this discussion, but putting it, whether it's in D&D, I don't want to say which department needs to do it, but saying the city has a stellar credit rating. The city of Boston has done a great job over the past decades in doing that because we don't max it out, so to speak, but do thoughtful capital planning. There is an avenue, a pathway that I think is certainly worth examining on a pilot program level to say, how is this going to impact it? You know, how much does this count on our balance sheet, so to speak? Don't want to be overextending ourselves, don't want to run into any trouble, but it's a conversation that could happen. You, I think, would need, you know, the city's bond lawyers, you know, the CFO's office, certainly this body involved in it. But it's something that, you know, especially as interest rates are rising right now, especially if it's being more challenging for people to get home loans, to think about that. And again, it's as I like to, and I know I said this before, I'm trying to think of as many revenue neutral ways to address the housing process. Yes, we need more money, we need more resources, we need to build more low income, very low income housing, but things that are not going to cost a lot of money, there's also a lot in that toolbox too.
Yeah, I think I'm a fan of exploring that as is Council Fernandez and Richardson.
I'm happy to help any way we can.
Okay, so we're going to go to closing statements now, I think, everybody. Councilor Bach, we'll start with you.
Sure, and I just want to address a couple of things that have come up here, because I think this is like what's so important about bringing these conversations together, the one that we had earlier and the one that we're having now, is that, you know, what's really interesting and unusual about the way that the BPDA's urban renewal powers were created by state statute is that a ton of the things that the city can do, the city can only do for municipal purposes. And the BPDA has this like broader remit where we can do things. And that is, Lydia used the word, a double-edged sword, because it's meant that historically they were able to use it for the economic benefit of private actors. But the really interesting thing is that when you talk about doing something for the economic benefit of Boston's lowest income communities, the BPDA's tools are actually better for doing that than the city of Boston's tools, because those people are actually private actors. So when you think about a program like this, like something where the city would be assisting, but ultimately ownership ends up being private, it's actually BPDA that allows us to put public resources more easily towards those things, especially when it has to do with land acquisition and property and all kinds of things, whether you're talking at the household level. Like the city, I suspect, if we were thinking about a like city guarantor program for affordable home ownership, where ultimately the ownership ends up being private, there's a very good chance that we would need to use BPDA powers in relation to that, because the city itself, the question would be, well, what's the municipal building that you're doing this for? So I just think that, and the funny thing is that I don't think that the real estate lobby would let us get these powers today at the State House. Like if we went today and we said, hey, we'd love to get, they would say, no, the city of Boston, you might do something crazy, socialist, right? Like, you know, that's what they'd say. And I think that, so to me, it's really interesting to think about a moment where the city is inventorying all its public parcels, and there's a real interest in using public land and public finance for public good, and thinking about that expansively, and also thinking about that in cases where it benefits quote-unquote private entities, but those private entities are our communities, or there are land trusts, right? Like, you know, as a way for our private entities to sort of form corporately. And to Councilor Baker's point about sort of like leverage and hooks, right? I mean, I think zoning has been historically a way that in Boston we've brought the community perspective in. But one of the reasons that there are folks like in Park Plaza who are concerned about us not giving up the renewal district there is because these LDAs, so if people look in the presentation for the other 9 districts, there's like everything that's colored has some BPDA restriction on it. And that's the leverage over private parcels in this area. Like that's what, basically within these areas, it's very hard for private entities to act without coming and working with us. And so that's like another level of kind of like public leverage and engagement. It's frankly the whole reason that the state's gonna have to really do business with us on the Hurley building, which otherwise they would probably just sell to the highest bidder and do what they would with, because it's in an urban renewal district and we have these hooks on it. So I just think that I think it's really interesting that we have a very different moment in terms of mayor and council, in terms of what we want to do. And we have this toolbox that has not with the exception of the DSNI case, necessarily been used in a lot of these ways, but which has the ability to be used in these ways. So I am really interested in that. I would love to see us do more with community land trusts, with building social and public housing, with the fact that some of that housing may not end up owned publicly, and therefore these BPDA tools let us execute on that. And I hope this is the beginning of a conversation about how we can really do this reimagining. So I'm grateful to everybody for coming today and to the BPDA for the first memo.
Thank you, Council Bog. Council Louis-Jean?
Yeah, I'm not going to belabor the moment. I really think, Josh, I mean, you're used to this, so I mean, but I really thank you, Mina, for spending a lot of your time here. Part of the reason I think Councilor Brock spoke to, you know, the need to, you know, the city has to do everything for a public purpose, which is why when Josh mentioned his idea, you know, part of potentially a pilot would be restricting it to publicly owned land. I think you probably have a greater hook of the city being an originator in that case, right, as a pilot. But I really, you know, this was very long. I really enjoyed this portion of the discussion for sure, because it's like thinking creatively about how we can use the city's tools for that community control and to build more affordable housing. So I just thank you all and look forward to working together. Thank you.
Council Fernandez-Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Josh and Mini, so much for your presentation. I really look forward to this. This is exciting. Thank you, Councilor Bach, Louis-Jean, as well, for filing this. I have to agree with my colleagues. There's a lot of opportunity here, and it's exciting times to be able to see the possibility of using these tools. Hopefully, I'd be interested to hear more from my colleague, Councilor Bach, about how we can actually leverage some of this possible power that we have with BPDA. So I'm looking forward to working sessions or further hearings and building a more affordable Boston, hopefully. Thank you.
In public testimony, there's nobody in the stands, but there is, Councilor Rowell, closing statement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the panelists for joining us today, and thank you to Councilor Bach and Councilor Louis-Jean for bringing this important topic to the floor. Definitely interested in what we can do, tools we can use as a city to make sure that we're developing public land to create affordable housing and also to protect the climate at the same time. Looking forward to continued discussions, and I missed a good amount of your presentation, but I have my staff members taking a look and taking down notes. But also feel free to reach out to have one-on-one conversations with the staff. Thank you.
And we have one letter that Council Barker is going to read into the record that's public testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And we received a number of letters of public testimony related to the Park Plaza district. Anthony Pangaro was here and was going to testify, but again, had to leave. So I'm just going to read his as a representative sample. The councilors should have in their inboxes a significant number of these. But this one from Anthony is, I'll just read it. My name is Anthony Pangaro, and I have resided in Boston since 1973 and at 1 Charles Street South in the Park Plaza area for the last 17 of those 49 years. I believe that an important neighborhood planning tool would be lost if the Park Plaza Urban Renewal Plan were closed out entirely, as is now scheduled for April 22nd of this year. While it may appear that the work contemplated in the Park Plaza Urban Renewal Plan is complete and is no longer necessary, you may recall the idea of selling the state transportation building has been floated from time to time. Because of the high price it could fetch in the private market, any redeveloper of the site would seek to build a much taller and more intensively used building. The existing building was restrained by the maximum 145-foot height currently allowed there by the Park Plaza Urban Renewal Plan. While the sale idea has faded for now, it can always return in the future or after a fire or other accidental cause affecting any of the buildings that sit near the public garden and the common. In addition, the current urban renewal plan names specific allowed uses that are consistent with the current surrounding residential uses and does not allow for others, like laboratory biotech space, for example. This height limit and control of use is not assured under the current zoning, which we know can be easily abridged by map changes, variances, and planned development areas. State law governing shadows caused by buildings on Boston Common and the public garden also have exceptions that are permissive for several hours of shadow during every day and also for certain times of year. These allow for taller buildings than those that currently exist and say nothing about use. On the other hand, urban renewal plans are subject to great scrutiny, requiring detailed Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act analysis of urban renewal plan modifications by its independent regulatory entities of state government. In short, this layer of extra protection can help to assure a long-term protection for residents living inside and outside of the urban renewal area, as well as for the public garden and the common themselves. I respectfully request that Park Plaza should be added to the list of 9 urban renewal plans to be extended. Otherwise, the plan will expire on April 22nd, 2022. The sought extension would be for the same period as the others, to allow for further study of the elements of each plan that might remain in place thereafter and until a new downtown plan can be enacted. Please know that your support would be most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Bach, and thank you guys for coming out. And the panel that came earlier, I thought it was informative, and this is what's important about getting in person. I think it's much better for us as councilors to be able to get a better understanding of the material. Josh, some good ideas. You know, I've been talking about mixed-use libraries the entire time I've been here. I would never build another single-story anything in the city, but also with the RFP should be going out with the city saying to the developers or whoever, this is what we want built and your zoning's already taken. So that cuts 3 years off the process right away. The minute you win that RFP, here's your thank you, your building permit, and then you start building, because it's that 3 years of if you're lucky, 3 years of carrying costs trying to get through a process, and that would go a long way, but I think it's good that we're having the conversations, and I appreciate you guys for coming out. With that, this hearing is adjourned.